Story number 1. I keep this between breath and steel, because paper goes missing on ships like mine. I speak now before the water learns my name better than I do. There were rooms that never showed up on blueprints, but they showed up in dreams. If you ever book a floating paradise, ask yourself who the ocean will remember afterward. I am not trying to be brave. I am trying to outlive a list. They hired me to keep a vessel alive, not to decide who stayed living inside it. I was paid to tighten valves, test alarms, and carry a ring of keys that opened doors I never questioned. I told myself duty was a map. Follow the line, fix the leak, log the time. That was before the map folded around me and hid a country inside the wall. This is a first-person record. I'll share what I did, what I failed to do, and the names I can still carry. Nothing here asks for trust. It only asks you to listen as if the hallway is listening too. I will not tell you the weather that night, because weather is what cruise brochures talk about. I will tell you the hour, 3:00 in the morning. I will tell you the corridor, a service wing that pretends to end, then bends. I was called for a burst line in a restricted zone near Deck 2, the kind of place guests wander past without ever seeing. My cart rattled over a scuffed seam. I logged my entry, scanned my badge, and stepped into air that felt refrigerated on purpose. The ship hum was different there, like someone had draped felt over the machinery to muffle more than noise. The job looked simple. Isolate, cut, couple, test. The panel was stubborn. I slid my pry bar, leaned my shoulder, and the wall gave up a sheet of metal, like a secret. The beam from my torch landed in a space that my training had not prepared me for. A room that existed behind the ship, as the ship you can see. Bedroll. Food tubs with labels peeled off. A bucket that made me swallow hard. But what slowed me down were the scratches, thick and desperate, lines furrowed into steel by someone who had nothing left but their hands. There were words, too, scored in multiple languages, not decorative, not artistic, just messages launched at the future like flares. I could not read them all, but every line translated to the same word inside me: help. I should have reported to security. Instead, I let curiosity pretend it was courage. I ran my master key down a list of nearby access points. Another panel, another room behind the room, then a third, then a fourth. They were siblings, same size, same makeshift bedding, the same scuffed geometry of resignations. In one, a curled page had been torn from a passenger manifest, a real one, the kind that travels with the ship like a spine. Names were there, and 2 of them I knew. The official story. They had gone overboard during a storm 4 nights prior. The official search had measured the sea and called it empty. The names, circled in red, said the sea had been an alibi. I took out my phone. Flash, flash, flash. I documented everything like a man who thought proof was a fireproof box. The smell in those pockets of the ship had a life of its own. Salt, metal, people, and something clinical that didn't belong to kitchens or laundry. On a shelf, I found a small notebook. The handwriting swerved between tidy and frantic, as if different hands had borrowed the same hour. Dates and times, transfer notes, mentions of injections that made sleep heavy and thinking slow. Some names received arrows to rooms I hadn't opened yet. Some names ended at nothing. Footsteps in the hall. Conversation in a tone built to sound casual. I slid the notebook into my tool bag, eased the metal sheet back into place, and braced a wrench against the open pipe like I had been posed for a training manual. 2 officers came to the doorway and let silence work on me. One of them, a man whose surname I'd filed as Martinez, studied the panel. Then me. He asked what I'd found. I told him I'd found exactly what the work order said existed, and not one thing more. He kept eye contact the way divers keep air counts. They moved on. I finished the repair, like repair could undo what I knew. By the time I wiped the seam and labeled my work, the panels I had opened elsewhere had been reinstated without a fingerprint. That moment felt like a mirror stepping back into the wall. Everything I saw was suddenly something I wasn't supposed to remember. I went to my sleeping quarters, carrying the wrong weight. I laid awake, listening to the corridor traffic, like it was a language. Hours later, when I reached for my phone to catalog the images, there were no images. The deletion was clean. No thumbnails, no cache, no backups. Wherever my photos had gone, they had traveled together like a lifeboat I wasn't allowed to board. But the notebook remained. I read it under a towel, under a blanket, under the kind of fear that makes your heart pace the same number as the ceiling rivets. The words inside the book did not tell a story. They reported a system. Criteria: solo travelers, cash customers, people whose missing posters would take longer to print. Method: medical contact or dining service. Lullabies poured into paper cups marked with smiley faces. Transfer windows during quiet hours. Phrases about buyers that met at certain ports with codes that looked like cargo labels. Phrases about excess and non-compliant that ended with night shift and open water. I decided to survive first and expose second. That sequence does not make me noble. It makes me practical. For 3 days, I ate from sealed packets with ingredients I could pronounce. I logged every corridor camera I passed and double-backed when I felt followed. I turned down every casual checkup the clinic tried to give me. Vitamins for stress, motion sickness remedies, wellness checks suggested with polite insistence. Our internet connection, always unreliable, became selective. Messages home failed while the ship's internal memos landed with perfect clarity. The network was not broken. It was obedient. I overheard Martinez talking to a colleague about a maintenance problem that needed to be resolved before docking. They chose terms that could belong to machinery or people. My name was not said. My name was assumed. I hid the notebook where routine would one day find it. I sealed it in plastic, climbed into an access crawl that tasted of dust and soap, and slid the package into an air duct above the passenger laundry facility, boring enough to be ignored, necessary enough to be serviced. I also broke my memory into pieces, writing the details onto slips of paper that I tucked into shoes, tool handles, inside the foam of my ear protection. If they searched me, I would look disorganized, not dangerous. The last night alone with the ship was longer than any storm. I barricaded my door using a case of fittings and a folded cart, then waited inside my own breath while a keycard whispered against the lock, and voices outside reorganized their plan. Dawn looks different when you didn't go to it willingly. When we docked, I walked down the gangway as if every step were a request. I went straight to the authorities. They listened, checked logs, and told me that no one had been reported missing on our voyage. The internal review concluded there was no wrong to find. And then, the punitive afterlife. My termination. My file flagged across the industry. My name taught to doors that would not open. If this were only about career, I would have folded. But there were those names. Those walls. That page from a manifest like a mouth refusing to close. There was also a detail I can't prove. The way certain staff learned to pause when I entered. The way clinic hours elongated when I walked by. The way I started speaking less because words began to feel expensive. I am telling you all this because the ocean keeps secrets for people who put them there. And so do corporations. I am telling you because a cease and desist letter looks very official when you hold it up to the light. But light passes through it in training. They tell you how a ship breathes. Air flows from intake to exhaust. Temperature differentials keep humans comfortable. Negative pressure rooms protect food and procedure. They don't tell you that airflow is also a language, where it's colder than it should be, where the hum lowers into a hush meant to disguise a different kind of operation. That night, the corridor felt like a confession. My light cut through dust that moved as if someone had just been there and decided to stop existing. I mapped the hidden rooms by geometry. Bulkheads that sat too far off the frame, conduits that disappeared into vanishing points. Each room had the same architecture of surrender, a roll mat with fabric worn to the print of a body, a plastic tub cut into a basin, labels peeled from protein bars, as if anonymity could be spread to food by contact. On one wall, a child's drawing, a rectangle with squares for windows and a smile in the sky. The sky had been crossed out and drawn again lower. Like maybe the artist learned what ceilings are. I flipped the notebook's pages by thumb because I could not bear to bend the spine. Timestamp, timestamp, timestamp. Transfers that coincided with events passengers would notice. Storm, gala, fireworks, crew appreciation, nights where the visible team is applauded while the invisible team works with both hands. The handwriting belonged to several people, and none of them wrote themselves into the story. It read like inventory, where the items could bleed. If you're expecting me to present myself as a hero, you will be disappointed. I was scared of the people who kept the rooms ready, and I was scared of whoever paid them to stay efficient. I rationed my fear into actions that did not get me killed. I repaired what I was paid to repair, and I studied what I was not paid to know. I learned the shift rotations of the men who kept security in sergeant major posture. I learned that one door opened, a second door opened a third, and that the third door always had new paint on the screws. I think about the two circled names the most, maybe because the circle is a human gesture, a way to say, I want to remember this, even while you prepare to forget. The official log said, overboard, and the ship performed the ritual. Alarms, search grid, people lining rails with hands over brows, pretending glare is the same as hindsight. But between the time a body hits a wake and the time a report hits a desk, there is room for a different story. The notebook mentioned criteria, and it mentioned ports. Certain cities were underlined. Swap points, like commuter trains for a schedule no one consented to. It also spoke of transfers to fleet, a phrase that sounds like promotion if you work engines, and sounds like distribution if you work in disappearing people. The entry that chilled me most was short. Not fit for sale. Night disposal approved. I did not sleep that night. Sleep would have required a future tense. I know that maintaining a ship means choosing what to ignore. The sea erases evidence faster than any legal team. The ship itself replaces panels, polishes floors, launders uniforms, until the fabric forgets the shape of the sweat it carried. But steel remembers. Trust me on this. Metal holds pressure and heat like a diary. Those scratches would still be there if anyone cared to look without the motive to paint. When the photos vanished from my phone, I understood the scale of what I had touched. This was not two men hustling a side trade. This was a network with enough authority to move through personal devices and enough reach to frame reality to the company's advantage. I received a random invitation for an extended wellness check at medical. I said no. The nurse smiled with precise kindness and suggested tea, mint for dizziness. I said no. My refusal already made me notable. I stopped eating anything that crossed a counter without its seal intact. Fear teaches efficiency. I shortened my routes. I memorized camera angles. I retaught myself to breathe through alarms that were not mine. When I finally placed the notebook in that air duct, I imagined a future technician pulling the grill and cursing the screws, then finding plastic and thinking it was trash before feeling the weight and knowing it was not. I kept working because a paycheck was the only story that still made sense on paper. Then came the conversation I overheard, the one where Martinez grouped me with gaskets. Maintenance issue, to be resolved prior to docking. I learned how to let a sentence walk past me while I stood still. I learned how to place my body behind the parts of the ship that care more about torque than about men. The final night asked me what kind of person I had decided to be. I pushed furniture against my door and sat with my back to a wall that connected to water. And I thought about the people who had sat in those false rooms, counting tiles, counting vents, counting scratches that didn't matter to anyone who owned the paint. Morning came, like it always comes, even when you don't feel entitled to it. I left the ship. I reported. I tried very hard to act like a citizen. The words I got back were phrases I could have written for them. No missing passenger reports. All protocols followed. Comprehensive internal review. The only thing that felt personalized was the termination notice with my name spelled right and the industry flag that followed me like a shadow with a lanyard. Someone will say I should have gone to the press. I did. They asked for evidence. I did not have what the world accepts. Timestamps with GPS. Chain of custody with signatures. Photos that survived deletion. I had a story and a map of a corridor that men like me are paid to fade into. I had the taste of disinfectant in a room where food wrappers hid nutrition facts like privacy. So I catalog what I can say without getting sued into dust. Rooms existed where no room should be. A manifest page had names the ocean was told to carry away. Security asked me questions that felt like statements. Medical offered me care I didn't ask for. The internet became directional. My employment ended with a neat explanation that did not explain me. If you boarded a Caribbean princess brochure, I hope you danced and swam and slept well. I hope you came home with photos you still have. But if you ever felt a cold draft where the hallway should be warm, if you ever heard heavy feet moving a light load at an hour when service turns invisible, know this: not everything on a ship is mapped for customers. Some doors are for cargo. Some are for lies. Some are exits for people who were never granted entry. I'm leaving this record in a place where documents don't get wiped by remote commands. I'm leaving it in the hearing of whoever still believes that a man can say, "My name is Leon," and have the world decide not to erase the rest. The final pages of the notebook mentioned other ships, not by full name, by initials and call signs and port calendars. The handwriting thinned, as if the hand had less time to press down. It said, "Common practice moved to other hulls. Audit not expected. Risk minimal." It listed criteria mirrored across vessels, then drew a small rectangle with an arrow to water. There was a single sentence at the very end. "If you find this, you are already being watched." I have never been good at speeches. I am a man who fixes leaks, not a man who fills auditoriums. So I will end with maintenance advice. If you feel something colder than it should be, ask why. If a panel looks new on old wall, ask who replaced it. If a company asks you to love it, ask what it does when you stop. I once believed 8 years of honest tools could insulate me from the reach of people who count passengers as quantities. I believe different things now. I believe in screws with fresh paint. I believe in names written in red. I believe in laundry rooms that hold more than soap, in air ducts that travel like sentences, in night shifts that teach the sea new words for disposal. And I believe the ship still carries secrets under its entertainment decks, the way a body hides bruises under long sleeves. You will ask what you can do with a story. You can remember it. You can repeat it where repeating is not easy. You can demand numbers that add up to faces, not just profits. And if a legal letter comes to your inbox with a stern header and a threat inside, you can save it, print it, and notice how thin the paper is. You can hold it to the light and see right through. If you've listened this far, you're already part of the record. If you ever walk a long hallway and feel watched, walk faster. If you hear the ship breathing, listen for the places where it holds its breath. If you work the night shift anywhere, leave a note where routine will find it. And if you ever find a notebook in a place that smells like soap and dust, read it where no one can reach your hands. Story number 2. I thought retirement would taste like citrus and salt, the way the sea mist licks your lips just before sunset. I booked a cabin, packed a paperback and a cardigan, and promised myself 1 week without sirens, charts, or next of kin. On the 3rd evening, pain pinched my sternum like a crab refusing to let go. Training overruled denial. I headed for the ship's clinic, a place most guests never see, a bright mouth cut into the metal belly of luxury. The door sighed shut behind me, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the gleam of instruments, but the smell. Antiseptic on top. Something sour beneath. As if the room had a secret it couldn't quite bleach away. A young woman with steady hands checked my pulse and spoke in the careful voice providers use when they know you know too much. She wrote my history, as though each word were being weighed for later. Then he arrived, and the room, titled by a few degrees, the difference between balance and a fall. That was when the night began to reroute my life. My name is Daphne. I'm a nurse by habit and history, a person trained to measure quiet things, the pause between breaths, the weight of a gaze, the arithmetic of risk. Travel brochures don't promise you any of that. They promise buffets and shore excursions, a neon promise that you can leave yourself on land. I didn't. I couldn't. Old instincts rode with me. The ship was the Norwegian Epic in October 2021. A floating city where everyone smiled a little wider after dark. From my table at dinner, I could watch the servers train their choreography, plates flashing like coins. Somewhere between the soup and the fish, a tightness began under my breastbone. No drama, just a quiet grievance that refused to ease with water and slow breathing. Experience is a stern teacher. It told me to get up. I found the medical bay by memory of hospital design. Follow the cleanest paint, the quietest corridor, and by the small placard that didn't ask to be noticed. The young clinician introduced herself as Rebecca. She moved with economy, a geometry that said she had practiced this dance many times. She took my history, noted prior exposures, ticked boxes I could have ticked for her. I felt seen, and for a minute, safe. Then the physician in charge entered, and the light in the room changed without dimming. He was introduced as Dr. Martinez. The details that mattered weren't printed on his badge. They lived in the tremor riding his hand like static, the dusk of something fermented on his breath, the way his eyes blinked on a delay. You can forgive a sailor his sea legs. You cannot forgive a physician his imbalance. He reviewed my EKG with the detached interest of someone trying to read a paragraph while listening to another conversation in his head. He proposed a plan, words slurring together, as if he were in a hurry to be done with them. A cannula kit appeared. The line placement that should have been rote became a pilgrimage. Miss. Muttered excuse. Miss again, I said, evenly. That another set of hands might be wise. His smile was a paper cut. You're in capable hands, he said. The nurse at the wall studied her shoes. The medication arrived in a syringe that looked too full. Something to ease you, he said. Sedative. The syllables didn't land right. Heat blossomed down my arm. The edges of the world softened, then drifted outward like a tide carrying chairs from a beach bar. My thoughts continued, but they lost their gravity. They floated instead of walking. A door stood, not entirely closed. Through its thin permission, the clinic unfolded itself. Curtained bays, a tray snapping shut, a metal clink that made everyone flinch except the man making it. The physician moved to another patient, an elderly gentleman whose chest rose in the shallow rhythm of a clock running down. A small procedure began, the kind that demands ritual, hand hygiene, sterile field, the squared-off respect of a drape. The ritual was performed as theater. not as faith. A tool fell, hesitated on the floor, returned to the stage without penance. Sedation loosens the rope on fear, but not on judgment. Training, even when dimmed, throws sparks. I counted missteps the way people count prayers, the dosage without double check. The monitor alarm hushed instead of investigated. The charting that read like fiction, drafted in the future tense. The curtain might as well have been a newspaper for how it concealed the truth. When the medication receded to low tide, words from the adjacent bay began to make sense. Rebecca spoke to another nurse about timing disposals and the next port, phrases that could have meant red bags and sharps bins if their voices hadn't been angled the way people angle their bodies when they carry something that drips. A gurney rolled past, covered, bringing with it the hush that accompanies anything shaped like a person lying very still. Ships announce deaths. Grief likes light. There had been no announcement. It is not difficult to hide a body on the water. You don't have to throw it over. You only have to move it somewhere beliefs grow dim. Cold rooms, dry stores, places where inventory is counted instead of names. The gurney turned toward a door I hadn't noticed. Utilitarian. The sort of portal where supplies go in and secrets come out. Words followed it. Process before morning. Documentation is a country where the powerful write the laws and the rest of us try to read them. I listened to the rewriting in real time. I heard the doctor joke about how paperwork could tame a hurricane, how a stroke, recorded resolutely enough, became a stroke in truth. I watched vital signs transcribed with more confidence than they had been measured. Around 4, the hour when night grows thin-skinned, he returned to my bedside. The drug had thinned, not vanished. My body lay heavy. My ears worked fine. He spoke quietly with Rebecca, their voices pitched like a bedside prayer. My name sat between them, a specimen on a tray. What did she see? Will she talk? Silence from Rebecca. Then a nod, a syllable shaped like consent. The solution proposed was pharmacologic and final. They had a phrase for it, final treatment, and a plan to pad the chart so a heart older than 67 could be blamed for its own exit. They traded memories of similar endings, offered to each other the reassurance of precedent. I did what nurses have always done when threatened by arrogance. I pretended to be less awake than I was. I kept my breaths even, my face slack, my heartbeat boring. When their footsteps thinned into distance, I tested the leash of my leads. Adhesive surrenders to intent. The monitor went dark in my bay, alive elsewhere. The door sighed again. Nobody looked up. The corridor was a throat large enough to swallow a person without chewing. I walked it. The carpet held me steady in ways the staff had not. At a junction, I paused to listen. Nothing but air conditioning and the faint clatter of a cart that could have belonged to housekeeping or to anyone at all. I found the service stair, the one painted the color of warning, and climbed until my legs burned in the good way. A pain reworded as proof of life. I didn't go to my cabin. Cabins are addresses. Addresses are where hunters wait. I learned to inhabit crowds, to become an unremarkable figure in other people's vacations. The solitary reader beside the pool. The woman studying maps outside the shore excursions desk. The early riser with coffee, who watches the horizon for the performance of sunrise. Every hour I added to my notebook. Times, faces, the phrases people think don't stick when said in low voices. I wrote the names that mattered. Deck 3, Medical Bay, Dr. Martinez, Rebecca. I wrote the numbers that might someday anchor a case. When land finally rose like a promise, it had a name I trusted. Barcelona. I disembarked with the first wave of anxious planners and honeymooners trailing luggage that squeaked. The city smelled like oranges and brakes. At the police station, the officer on duty was patient until jurisdiction arrived to swallow his patience whole. Flags and flags of convenience, waters territorial and otherwise, nationalities and registries. Investigation on the ocean is a game of hot potato played with paperwork. I refused the potato. I kept it in my lap and let it cool. The company moved faster. Their legal team reached out with a tone you use on a beloved aunt who is wrong about a family story. They offered to resolve the matter. Language that floated like a white flower on water, pretty and useless. They attached documents explaining that the physician had suffered his own medical event, that my care had unfolded during a temporary emergency, heroically managed. Every irregularity baptized as necessity. I read the lines, and then the spaces between them, the way nurses read the blank areas on forms where truth is often shy. Their human resources database performed a trick more impressive than any stage magician's. Dr. Martinez vanished from it. I called licensing boards. They wanted docket numbers and dates of birth. I called maritime agencies. They wanted the flag. I called a reporter I admired. She wanted corroboration, a witness who had not been medicated, a photo of a tool on a floor that needed sterilizing and didn't get it. I had ink and insomnia. It is hard to persuade people that evil wears scrubs. It is harder when the setting is a place built for happiness. But medicine is power, plus chemistry, plus narrative. And on a ship, that narrative can be steered as surely as the hull. Elderly people die away from land all the time. Bodies cool in rooms far from family. Forms are completed by those who hold the pens. A clean death is rarely questioned. A dirty one, if documented as clean, passes through systems like a forged coin that is never weighed. I learned the shape of my fear, and it was not a monster's shadow. It was an office with a closed door, a screen with a locked file, a list of names paired with no addresses. It was the knowledge that with the right drug, at the right moment, a heart could be told to leave quietly, and the chart would produce a choir to sing it away. So I did not go back to sea. I kept my records, and when sleep became a place I couldn't enter unarmed, I opened them and read until the words calmed me by becoming just marks on paper. Some nights I imagine the medical bay understaffed at dawn, someone realizing a patient is missing, the scramble to rewrite what should have been written differently. Other nights I imagine a storage door opening, a clerk counting inventory and pausing at a shape the spreadsheet doesn't list. In both versions, nothing makes a sound. That is how you recognize a perfect crime, not by the noise of it, but by the silence it produces afterward. I age as honestly as I can. I take my pills with breakfast. I walk until my lungs remind me that breath is a gift and not a guarantee. I tell my story to people who think cruises are catalogs of sunsets. I use the names I can prove and the details I can defend. And when I reach the part where they planned to end me with a therapeutic flourish, I do not tremble. I sit upright in the chair, and I lean forward, and I say the sentence out loud. I say it so they can hear the weight of it. Then I ask them to listen when the next family is told a heart was lost despite best efforts, on a night when the sea was calm and the clinic was clean, and everyone present did exactly what they wrote that they did, because somewhere, on some vessel, someone still trusts a man in a white coat who smells like the wrong kind of evening. Somewhere a nurse is telling herself not to make trouble. Somewhere a chart is preparing to become a weapon. And somewhere a door that shouldn't open will open anyway. And a covered shape will pass through it on quiet wheels. Truth doesn't drown at sea. It waits. It washes ashore in paper, in memory, in the unshakable knowledge of one woman who refused to die politely. I was supposed to sip my retirement, one shore excursion at a time. Instead, I learned again what I first learned at 22. That vigilance is not paranoia, that courage is not loud, and that survival sometimes looks like a middle-aged woman blending into a crowd, writing notes with a borrowed pen and keeping her heartbeat steady until sunrise. I did not plan to become a witness. I did not plan to become a warning. But I am both. And until someone weighs the coin and recognizes the forgery, I will keep speaking. I will keep saying the names. Daphne, Rebecca, Dr. Martinez, Norwegian epic. I will keep telling you how the sea was beautiful and the clinic was bright, and how, when the door did not close all the way, the truth walked out and stood beside my bed, waiting for me to stand up and follow it into the light. Story number 3. I trusted clear air more than any voice printed on a daily newsletter. I married under a forecast of calm and found a ledger of lies instead. Steel remembers truth even when men rehearse it away. Every cover story breaks first at the edges, where scraped paint catches the light. If the sea is a courtroom, our starboard hull was the witness no lawyer could silence. I have spent my adult life reading the sky like a confession. Pressure tells me what people won't. Wind direction exposes where they've been. On the 5th night of our honeymoon, that simple creed saved my wife and me from swallowing a story designed to make us small and quiet. We had embarked on a northern loop that sounded like a promise. New York to the blue rim of Iceland, expecting fog, cold sun, and the kind of slow evenings that make you forgive the world. I carried a pocket barometer and a compact anemometer, the way other newlyweds carry disposable cameras. My name is Dean, and as a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, I've spent my career studying storms and weather patterns across the Atlantic. Sarah teased me about the instruments. I teased back that they were lighter than regret. Everything seemed normal for the first 4 days of our cruise. The sunsets scattered on high cloud like crushed copper. Swells were polite. The windstroke rarely raised its voice above 20 knots. I spent hours on deck with my portable weather instruments, comparing my readings to the ship's official reports and finding them consistently accurate. At 2 in the morning, the mattress lurched as if the ocean had clenched a fist. Furniture marched to the floor. A glass spun once and lay still, as if ashamed of the noise it had made. Sarah gripped my forearm and looked for language. I looked for a storm that did not exist. The official announcement came about 30 minutes later, delivered over the intercom by the captain in a calm, measured tone that seemed almost rehearsed. He spoke of a rogue squall, damage to the exterior, a temporary pause while the crew assessed. He told us to remain in our rooms. It was a tidy paragraph, the kind that fits inside a brochure. It did not fit the sky. I pulled up satellite composites over the ship's internet. Maps I knew, like the backs of my hands. Pressure was smooth. No vorticity, no convective signatures, no baroclinic leaf unwinding in our neighborhood. I checked my own numbers. Fall rate negligible. Winds had been gentle and loyal. The only storm was inside the loudspeaker. We went up anyway. Open air is honest. The night was a clear sheet of glass, a moon that refused to be an accomplice. Light winds and calm seas stroked the surface. Visibility was the kind of flawless that makes sailors religious. What broke that perfection was the starboard flank of our ship. Metal twisted in petals, plates punched inward, paint shaved away in long parallel bands like the fingerprints of another vessel. There were scrape marks along the hull that appeared to have been made by another vessel. The pattern wasn't wave bite. It was contact. I began to gather a record the way a diver gathers breath before a descent. Angles, lengths, sheer patterns. Sarah's phone lit edges. The lower deck had coughed up flotsam that wasn't ours. Fiberglass shards, a ribbon of unfamiliar paint, the curled lip of a broken life ring with half a name that pointed to someone who didn't belong on our manifest. We found fragments that were clearly from another vessel, including pieces with paint and markings that didn't match anything on our ship around us. Uniforms moved with purpose that had the wrong flavor. They weren't patching weather damage. They were containing a narrative. Sealed containers swallowed pieces we would have kept. Doors to work corridors that had been casually propped open on other nights were now locked. As if curiosity itself were a kind of leak, morning arrived, carrying a polished lie. He claimed that we had been hit by a sudden squall, with winds exceeding 70 knots and waves over 30 feet high. He dressed the lie as data. Wind speeds, wave heights, a sudden pressure collapse. It would have been a fine bedtime story for people who don't court numbers for a living. I tried again to open my meteorological portals. Access denied. I tried to compare the ship's archived observations. Updated. Now aligning with the myth like soldiers at inspection. The ship's public weather information system had also been updated to show historical data that supported the storm narrative. Sarah and I sat at breakfast, picking apart the story, like a bonefish. A junior officer at the next table said the word collision softly before replacing it with event. Passengers traded misgivings. No one remembered the heave you feel with 30-foot walls of water. Someone had seen lights right before the impact. Someone else had heard a sound like grinding metal. The stubborn kind that deals in friction rather than foam. Crew members drifted between clusters of voices as if conversation itself were a hazardous material. Where questions sprouted. Officers arrived with soothing phrases and the soft authority of a script. When the talk did not soften, security asked for a quick word, and people returned changed. Keen edges dulled, stories mislaid. Sarah knew me well enough to read the ticking behind my cheekbones. She took my hand and squeezed once. We walked the ship like surveyors, mapping both steel and behavior. Somewhere a truth larger than us was struggling to surface, and someone was tamping it down with professional efficiency. By early afternoon, curiosity had become a compass I couldn't put away. We followed the smell of brine and machine oil to a back passage that should have been locked, and, for 3 breaths, wasn't. Inside, the past 10 hours were arranged on pallets and tarps, tagged and ready for a future the sea was not meant to see. Hull plating with registration numerals, not our own. The corner of a wooden chair, a life jacket with a stitched surname that didn't match any on the daily welcome screen. Luggage with stickers from a scientific conference. The quantity alone shouted what the PA had denied. Another hull had kissed ours, and not lightly. Then we saw the refrigeration unit. I do not want to tell you what we saw, because I do not want to hold it again. The remains were wrapped in plastic and stored in a refrigerated container. My work has placed me at crash sites before. The human body has ways of telling you what happened when the witness cannot. This told us that the night had collected a tally, and that the ledger was being balanced in secret. Sarah's breath thinned, but she steadied. "Document?" she said, and I heard a vow inside the word. We shot what we could, fast and quiet. I uploaded redundancies to multiple clouds, titled them like shopping lists, sent them to colleagues who would notice if I stopped answering. Storing the images in multiple cloud storage accounts and sending copies to trusted colleagues back home with instructions to contact authorities if anything happened to us. Somewhere between fear and duty, we drew a line we couldn't pretend not to see. Rules for staying alive on a ship that wants to forget. Stay visible. Stay boring. Eat from sealed containers. Drink from your own bottles. Never both sleep at once. We wrote them down on napkins, as if writing could harden them into law. We also began leaving detailed notes about our discoveries in various locations throughout the ship. If someone came for us, we wanted breadcrumbs to stain their hands. Security stopped pretending. 2 men followed us from the theater to the promenade, from the promenade to the library, with its curated stillness. Our cabin took on the scent of hands that weren't ours. Drawers disagreed with the way we had closed them. Our cabin was searched multiple times while we were away, with items moved and personal belongings obviously examined. The ship's intranet shed features in our direction. Logins failed. Bandwidth starved. And yet the nightly newsletter grew lush with barometric drama that would have been comical, if not weaponized. The ship's communication systems became completely unavailable to us at night. When the horizon erased itself, we learned the rhythm of the deckhands who worked far from passenger eyes. Containers appeared, unlabeled, decisive, and toppled into the dark. Sea law loves paperwork. The ocean does not. I thought of mothers who would scan headlines that never mention the sound a steel edge makes when it slips into cold water. Other passengers began to wear a grayness in their faces. The word passed. Food poisoning. I have seen food poisoning. This wasn't it. Pupils told a different story. The shuffle of steps told a different story. Sarah and I adjusted our menu to whatever came wrapped and closed. We bought instant coffee from the cafe and hoarded the packets as if they were medicine. We lasted like that, measuring our fear into useful tasks, until Reykjavik lifted out of the North Atlantic like a verdict. We moved fast. We were among the first passengers off the ship, and we immediately went to local authorities with our evidence. I thought arrival would loosen the coil in my chest. Instead, I learned how far a corporate arm can reach. The customs line was a bright corridor, crowded with sleepy travelers. Somewhere between the scan and the stamp, the bag with the jagged fiberglass and the painted curl turned lighter. The zipper pull smiled at me with innocent metal. The evidence was gone before it could be registered as such. Inside the police building, a lawyer's vocabulary erected fences, and our words suddenly needed permissions to stand. The debris we had collected mysteriously disappeared from our luggage during the customs process. My photos survived, several of them. Anyway, but the first response was doubt in a pressed shirt. Maybe the images were misinterpreted. Maybe the numbers were incomplete. Maybe an unscheduled storm had simply chosen not to appear on a dozen independent platforms. We kept talking. We wrote statements that hurt our hands. We surrendered digital copies to folders that swallowed them without promises. International waters turned out to be less a place than a strategy. Flags of convenience are very convenient when bodies become evidence. An inquiry did open, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid of what it might become if it walked too quickly. Our persistence eventually led to an international maritime investigation that uncovered evidence of the collision and the cover-up. It traced the debris chain to a small research vessel reported missing. The other vessel was eventually identified as a small research ship that had been reported missing around the time of our cruise, with all hands presumed lost at sea. Families waited with strong eyes and weak hands. What they received was a statement, carefully engineered to be both something and nothing. Fines were paid that cost less than a week of bar receipts. The cruise line faced only minor penalties that amounted to little more than the cost of doing business. If you ask me what changed in me, it's easy to say trust, but the word is too blunt. I still trust the sea. I trust wind profiles and pressure slopes and the way a cap cloud lays over a summit. What I no longer trust is the neatness of official language when it arrives pre-packaged with a threat of convenience. People died, not in a storm that never was, but in a collision that carved dates into steel. We had witnessed a mass murder disguised as an accident. That is the sentence I write in my notebook when the room is dark. I do not read it out loud because I want to sleep sometimes. Sarah and I still travel, just differently. We print our documents. We ship duplicates of our files to addresses we trust. We memorize emergency routes, not because we plan to be brave, but because people who want to live should know where doors are. I keep my instruments, and I keep my habit of looking at the sky before I listen to men with microphones. There are moments, usually at dawn, when the ocean is so smooth you could believe in unbrokenness. I let myself stand inside those moments. Then I remember a stripe of shaved paint and a registration number that did not belong to us. The sea carries what we give it: ash, confession, courage. I am still a meteorologist. I still teach students that a barometer is a story that writes itself in slow ink. I tell them that sometimes you must become the instrument. You must hold the reading steady when the official station is being recalibrated to flatter the people signing the checks. One more truth, and I am done. Somewhere below 30 fathoms on a route between continents, there is a little rain of screws and fragments that were ours, and a little rain of screws and fragments that were theirs. On charts, the place is just blue. On steel, it is the distance between what happened and what is allowed to be said. This is how we tried to close the circle. Sarah and I, we built a timeline without permission. Last truthful anemometer reading. Time of impact inferred by passenger clocks. First announcement. First security sweep. First sealed container. First container overboard. We matched that against satellite passes from neighboring platforms saved by colleagues who owed me favors. We reconstructed a wind field that could not have produced what the ship described without violating physics. We took the hull photographs, measured striation spacing, mapped them to the likely contact angle of a vessel of known beam. The numbers did not scream. They simply stood there, implausible to ignore. We learned the names of the researchers whose ship did not return. We were careful with our grief. It was not ours to spend. In a quiet kitchen a year later, one of the daughters asked us if her father had time to be afraid. I wanted to give her a meteorologist's answer about seconds and inertia and thresholds. I said that people doing meaningful work often meet danger already in motion, and that love has a way of arriving faster than fear. She cried without wrecking herself. After she left, Sarah placed both palms on the table and kept them there, as if steadying the world. Journalists came and went, some with eyes like anchors, some with eyes like shopping lists. A few told the story well enough to make a difference. Most found the edges too sharp to carry into print without cutting the hands that fed them. A lawyer once told me that hope is inadmissible. I told him that tide tables do not ask permission to be believed. If you are listening in a dark room, and if you are the kind of person who looks up wind maps before you pack a jacket, this is for you. Memorize the difference between drift and force, between turbulence and intent. When steel folds like paper in a direction that the wave train cannot explain, you are not looking at weather. You are looking at a decision. When data appears after the fact, dressed perfectly for the story, you are looking at a costume. I keep a small case now, a barometer I trust, a hand crank light, a laminated card with emergency frequencies, a USB drive that duplicates itself every time I open my laptop. I keep one more thing. We were effectively cut off from the outside world and trapped on a ship with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. That sentence is a thorn. It keeps the wound from closing wrong. On a good day, I believe the investigation will be reopened when a conscience fails to sleep, when a file goes missing from the company that hid too much order in its weather. On a better day, I imagine laws rewritten by people who understand that the sea's size is not a moral excuse. On the days in between, I write down readings, pressure, wind, cloud. I write the sky as witness, not alibi. Sarah asked me once whether I would have rather not known. I looked at her and thought of the refrigerated room, the careful tag on a piece of hull with a stranger's number, the sound of containers meeting dark water, the practiced calm on a face that had rehearsed empathy. I told her I preferred the truth that bruises to the fiction that embalms. She nodded in that measured way of hers and poured our coffee as if we had invented morning. Here is the final thing I will keep saying until it stops being necessary. Not only had our ship collided with another vessel, but people had died in the collision, and the cruise line was covering up their deaths rather than reporting the incident to authorities. If that sentence makes someone uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the first honest weather inside a room full of counterfeit barometers. And if you ever find yourself at sea on a night too clear for the story you're being sold, step outside. Let the cold tell you what's possible. Read the wind with your face. Walk to the rail and look at the paint where the light is blunt. The sea will not lie for you or to you. That task belongs to people. Believe the sky instead. Story number 4. I thought solitude would be safety. On that ship, I learned solitude can be a spotlight. I bought privacy and got a stage. Locks keep doors shut. They do not keep eyes out. When authority shrugs, fear grows muscle. I went to sea to drift. Something else had a map. I was 22, stubborn with optimism, and breaking open a life I had earned with scholarships, ramen, and a graduation gown that still smelled like fresh polyester. I picked the cheapest passage I could find because I wanted the horizon more than a balcony. Carnival freedom, Western Caribbean, a tiny windowless room on deck 2. Friends teased me for choosing the kind of cabin people book only to sleep in. That was my plan: stash my bag, chase sunsets, collect islands like postcards. Freedom, I thought, would be the distance between me and everything that had kept me small. The first ripple was small enough to dismiss. A bag not where I left it. A lotion bottle turned label out. My suitcase planted at the foot of the bed, edged left, as if someone had nudged it with a shoe. I took a breath, measured the room with my eyes, and decided memory was fickle. Later that night, I returned from a lounge where the singer made strangers feel like regulars. I slipped the card, felt the latch, stepped in, and froze. The desk chair faced the door like a person about to rise. The charging cable coiled onto my pillow like a posed question. I told myself, "You're tired. You're alone. You're making ghosts out of housekeeping. Doubt is a private weather." Mine turned. I began to grid my life. Before leaving the cabin, I photographed every angle. The toothbrush slanted this way, the zipper pull pointing that way, the laptop closed and centered with its brand name aligned to the fake wood grain. I tucked a strand of hair across the closet seam. When I came back, my pictures disagreed with the room. The hair was gone. The laptop sat half open, screen tilted, as if someone had measured the degree. Drawers wore fingerprints of thought, shirts shuffled, underwear and bras promoted to eye level, not thrown, but curated, as if an audience had been invited. The evidence was undeniable. Someone with access to my room was regularly entering when I was away and systematically examining my personal belongings. The sentence formed in my head and would not leave. Fear changes hearing. You start to listen the way prey listens, to air pressure, to doors that seem too quiet, to footsteps that never quite become sound. I reported it. I was smiled at. Stress, they said, can make things feel misplaced. Keys are controlled, they said. Crew is vetted. They promised to look into footage, then told me cameras around my corridor had technical issues. The word malfunction is a shrug in a uniform. On the 5th night, I changed my script. I left dinner early, let the dining room's warmth slide off me, and walked the spine of the ship with my breath counting the steps. Outside my hallway, I slowed, lifted my wrist as if to check a watch I didn't wear, and saw a figure in a crew uniform using a key card to enter my cabin. Average height, forgettable build, head angled down so the face became a guess. I stopped behind the corner and trained myself to stillness. Minutes approached the speed of weather. When the door opened again, the figure turned toward my hiding place with the terrible casualness of the practiced, then walked away calmly and confidently, like anyone finishing a task. Inside, the message was arranged like a ritual. My personal items had been arranged with precise, devout attention. My phone had been connected to the charging cable and positioned on the pillow next to where my head would rest. On the desk, printed photos from my social media, not just shipboard candids, but older life, the kind I didn't post often. Each image wore handwritten notes in a tidy schoolteacher print. Comments about my route to work, which gas station was cheapest near my apartment, the color of my father's truck. Someone had compiled an index of me. I could feel the hours behind it. The way some people build model ships in bottles, I carried the stack and my shaking into the ship's security office. A man who introduced himself as Rodriguez listened with his mouth set to concern. He recommended a move to a different cabin. I asked for guarantees he couldn't give. If keys travel on rings and rosters, what changes with a new door? He did not answer. He offered policy, which is a word that tries to sound like protection while admitting very little. I exited his office, knowing I had described a fire to a man who worried about insurance. The next 2 days were logistics under siege. I learned how to live inside the herd, to stand with families so a stroller became cover, to drift with bridal parties so their laughter made a wall I could hide behind. I mapped my eating to peak hours. I picked seats that let me watch angles and mirrors. I propped a chair against my cabin door, even though I knew chairs only delay. They do not stop. Still, the reminders came. Notes slipped under my cabin door. Items relocated. My towel folded into an animal I had not authorized. I collected these signs like a person collects symptoms, as if naming them could cancel them. Women find each other in currents like this. One at the pool rail said she slept with the television on because silence felt like a trap. Another in the atrium said she had reported a man who appeared and reappeared at whatever bar she chose, like a habit with legs. A third had woken to the sense of air in her room that was not her own. The pattern felt larger than any one face. The ship, for all its glitter, had blind corners built into its smile when land finally rose out of mourning like a promise. I realized I was arriving without proof a courtroom likes. The law is geography. Out there, jurisdictional complications multiply. International waters make suspects into shadows. The FBI agent who returned my call summarized maritime crimes in a tone that wanted to be kind. Difficult to investigate, difficult to prosecute, more difficult when corporations erect their own weather systems of liability. The photos and notes I carried vanished between disembarkation and customs, an absence that felt designed even if it wasn't. Loss can be engineered or accidental. Either way, it does the same job. Home was inventory and ritual. I changed locks, rotated routes, excised old posts, removed geotags, learned to speak to myself in sentences that made space for vigilance without making a shrine to fear. I filed reports that will likely live inside folders. No one opens on purpose. I taught my hands to stop shaking by giving them tasks, shredding mail, backing up drives, placing a thread exactly so across the seam of a drawer, and checking. I tell this without theatrics because subtlety was the weapon used against me. The intrusions were calibrated to be deniable. That is the elegance of certain predators. They don't need force when they have familiarity. They require your routine more than your body. They study your map until they can move in your absence the way you move in your presence. On that ship, I met a person, or a collection of policies wearing a person, who understood that terror can be administrative if you travel alone. Build redundancies into your quiet. Photograph your space. Yes, but also place a hair on a laptop hinge, a thread across a zipper, a faint line of talc behind a door, evidence a camera can't mislabel. Log out of everything. Two-factor the boring. Sit where you can see reflections. Pick elevators that arrive with crowds. Learn the names of people who notice things for a living. Bartenders, cleaners, the woman who manages the morning coffee line with grace. And when an institution rehearses the sentence, "Your safety matters," ask for the audit trail, the logs, the real nouns. I thought I bought a week of sea and sleep. I bought a lesson in power. Somewhere on a manifest is a name that once opened a door to a tiny, windowless room on deck 2, ran a palm across my life, and walked away calmly and confidently, as if my schedule, my messages, my breath itself were part of the job. I don't dream of waves anymore. I dream of corridors and keys. Story number 5. The sea wears innocence on its surface. Its machinery keeps the real secrets in heat, pressure, and choices made when no one is looking. I went aboard to nurse engines, not to measure the distance between a vibration and a funeral. Rules save lives until they're used to silence the people who follow them. Timetables feel harmless until the clock is wound with somebody's breath. What burned on that voyage was not only oil, it was trust, reduced to residue. I am Evan, 31 then, a marine engineer who learned to read steel the way a medic reads a pulse. Years at sea taught me that a big engine is less a machine than an animal with moods. It sulks when it is starved of clean fuel, grows irritable under sloppy load changes, and whispers its pain through the deck before a gauge can spell it out. That November, I joined an MSC liner working a Baltic loop. 4 main diesels lived under the waterline like hearts in a metal chest. And my work was the usual litany: trend the plots, listen with souls and palms, catch the small lies that precede the public disasters. It should have been routine. Routine is the word we say when our luck has not yet been tested. The engine room was a bright cathedral in perpetual dawn. Sodium lights, pale haze. The turbine's tenor wound into the hull. Air felt dense there, like it carried a gravity of its own. Thermometers were abstractions. The real temperature lived inside your teeth. I liked that place, the way some people like libraries. Racks hummed their chessboard answers. The floor kept time with power strokes. Everything obeyed a physics that rewarded humility and punished denial. On the 6th day out, the weather tightened its fist. Short-period seas slapped the plates, and the rails collected cold like a dare. I had the morning watch and moved through the compartment the way you move through a hospital corridor at shift change. Alert to the whispers you only hear if you are already listening. Engine 3 carried an off-grammar tremor. Not a dramatic wobble, not something a passenger would notice in their coffee. Just a stutter low enough to embarrass a sensor and honest enough to confess itself to skin. In training, they say trend. Don't guess. Experience teaches the corollary. Trend, but also feel. I felt a story trying to start. I did what engineers are paid to do. Drew a boundary around risk. The practical steps were plain. Take 3 offline. Isolate. Open the train. Check clearances where clearances like to lie. Test the rod assembly with die and patience. Confirm or disprove the fear while we still had time to choose. I wrote it down. I said it out loud. And I was told, no. A man with more stripes and a tidy calendar weighed our hours against a port slot and declared the ship safe enough to stay pretty. We were behind schedule. Passengers had plans. Delays cost. Warnings felt negotiable. He called my caution dramatic. He had never stood beside a conrod after it forgot its purpose. I stayed with 3, anyway. I watched the harmonic signature thicken into a shape my gut recognized. The math was walking toward us in heavy boots. 2 mechanics, Rodriguez and Thompson, drifted into my orbit, like good men do when something feels off. They were the steady kind, allergic to theater, the people you want near you when the work gets hot. We agreed on the plan. We would execute the instant permission existed. It didn't come. The day acquired that brittle clarity. Disasters, love. The passageway air seemed too clean. The lighting felt a shade too bright. It was as if the world had leaned forward to hear. I closed one eye to watch the amplitude on the vibration trace, then opened both to scan the hard, ordinary facts. Flange bolts still safety wired. Lube temperatures in the upper end of normal. Exhaust colors stubbornly honest. Data lies politely before it tells the truth. The truth was living in the beat under my boots. I phoned up the chain again and laid out the equation without adjectives. Shut, lock, inspect, measure, decide. I received the kind of answer that sounds professional until you realize it's fear wearing cologne. We would monitor. We would review at the next window. We would keep all power available because guests had commitments. Somewhere on another deck, someone was planning a city tour. In our deck, a rod was planning an exit. Rodriguez carried a thoughtful quiet that made other people calmer. Thompson had a bricklayer's humor and the confidence of someone who had solved enough problems to misplace respect for the ones he hadn't met yet. I told them to leave 3 alone until we could shut her down. They nodded. But we were sailors in a house that prized punctuality over physics. The two worlds always coexist on a ship, the show up top and the work below. That day, the show won the vote. I wrote a final note in my log, using the plainest words I could find. If safety has a language, it's the one with short sentences and no metaphors. I listed the observations, the suspected failure mode, the immediate mitigation, and the worst-case scenario. If someone had read it with their eyes instead of their agenda, none of what followed would have been necessary. At 14:15, energy decided it would no longer be contained. I mark the moment without gore because memory already punished me enough. A member inside the block failed with the inevitability of math. Things designed to spin stayed still. Things designed to stay still moved. The first violence opened the door. The heat finished the argument, and pathways that carried orders melted into decoration. The room that had been my workplace turned unfamiliar in a span shorter than a decision. Emergency doctrine rests on the idea that signals travel. Ours didn't. Control lines had become decorations. Valves waited for commands that would never arrive. And the auto systems more than one training slide had called fail-safe, discovered the new verb failed. You can only do what remains. We did. Access choked down to impossible angles. Visibility reduced to an index of faith. The human body tolerates little of a space designed for thermodynamics rather than lungs. 2 men did not come back from that room. I will not set down their final minutes to be consumed by strangers. I will say they were competent, careful, and badly served by a hierarchy that preferred plausible deniability to a wrench in time. There are kinds of quiet that follow death in a machinery space. This one sat in the throat like metal. The ship did what large ships do. It continued. Momentum has a diplomacy all its own. On the upper decks, announcements offered distractions and soft light. In our decks, we counted what was left and tried to understand the choreography of the failure. I annotated my earlier warnings until the ink looked like a protest. Leaders can widen the truth or constrict it. The choice announces a culture with more clarity than any slogan. Our leadership chose constriction. The space was sealed, not with reverence for evidence, but with fear of it. A small procession of company people arrived. Lanyards, measured tones, phrases rehearsed in rooms far from salt. Chain of custody stepped onto the stage. Items on the unflattering list acquired a talent for disappearing. What used to be a connecting member with a history became something else entirely, complete with a provenance that made the problem look like it had never existed. Documents changed. Logs gained an alibi. The ship's data recorders, those proud, independent witnesses we had been told could not be tampered with, suffered an oddly precise bout of amnesia covering the exact minutes that mattered. Meanwhile, a draft conclusion nucleated out of the air. Procedural deviation, unauthorized activity, human factors. It was elegant, in the way a forged signature can be elegant if you only glance. I appealed to the architecture of accountability. Flags, port states, conventions with words like safety in their titles. I attached scans of my original notes. Replies drifted back with immaculate punctuation, and the kind of distance that says, A story has already been assigned its ending. Somewhere between the deck plates and the boardroom. Cause and effect swapped seats. Reputation is a ship, too. It turns slowly, but crushes small boats. Suddenly, my decade of faultless practice was a footnote to temperament. I became difficult, the kind of engineer who overinterprets noise, the sort of employee who disagrees with established processes. Calls stopped returning. Interviews clipped themselves short with polite phrases that felt like doors. Grief is not a single event, but a system. It has components: shock, anger, resolve, and they fail in series. Sleep thinned. I would be making coffee and smell hot oil, though the room was cold. Streetlights reflected in windows turned into imagined indicator lamps at the edge of vision. Therapy offered vocabulary. Contracts offered handcuffs. I learned how the world says we believe in safety, while punishing the people who tried to practice it. I had to leave the water, not because the work scared me, but because the industry no longer trusted me to do it. I learned new acronyms and pretended my hands didn't miss the warmth of a throttling handle. Reinvention is not heroic. It is a form of exile. Every time a ferry horn reached my apartment, the small part of me that still loved machinery wrote another line in a ledger I had not wanted to keep. Do I think similar failures continue? I think they do, where timetables are sovereign and maintenance is a rumor. I think another engineer has felt a familiar tremor, reported it, and been told to monitor. I think a chief somewhere has mastered the dark art of turning caution into insubordination. I think two families are reading language about operator error, while photographs in their homes keep insisting on skill, humility, and care. Years after the Baltic, I still assess rooms with a mechanic's eye. I count exits. I inventory cables. I trust my instincts over polished speeches. When headlines about maritime incidents scroll past, I read them the way some people read epitaphs, listening for phrasing that signals a brand won over physics again. I imagine how many minutes of warning lived between first tremor and final headline. Sometimes I dream about a briefing where someone in authority says, "We stopped because someone said to stop," and the room does not laugh. I do not want absolution. I wrote the warnings and stayed on station under an order that should never have been given. The truth has weight. I carry mine. I say Rodriguez and Thompson by name because memory must defeat paperwork. I say to the next engineer, your craft matters more than a timetable. A ship is a compromise with the ocean. It should not also be a compromise with pride. If your chart speaks of caution, believe it. If your palm feels a fault the sensors haven't caught, move the levers accordingly. The only people who will ever thank you are the ones who get to age. And that is enough. I tell this for families who were handed scripted condolence and told to be grateful. Your people were competent. Your people were careful. They were failed by a system designed to prize a certainty, even where certainty is a lie. If there is any justice left in our trade, it will be this. The next time a ship trembles wrong, someone will choose to be late. Until then, I keep a ledger. On one side live the miles, the geometry of crank webs, the small pleasures of a clean trace. On the other side live two names and the compound interest of silence. The arithmetic never balances. But arithmetic is not the only language we have. We also have promise. Mine is simple. When a junior says isolate, I will pull the handle. When a schedule says hurry, I will repeat not today. When a leader says trust me, I will answer show me the plot. That is how we make the ocean a little less hungry. Story number 6. I signed to scrub luxury and found a ledger of ghosts. The first door I unlocked paid me in dread, not dollars. Medicine should save. On deck 3, it became currency. Every corridor has a rumor. Ours kept account. I learned the sea doesn't hide crimes. It launders them. I was 19 when money felt like the only key anyone respected. The contract promised routine. Sheets folded to razor lines. Brass polished until it could see itself. A bunk I barely touched. The brochure language said career pathway, team culture, opportunity. I boarded the Pacific Princess because college deadlines were hunting me, and I thought labor would outpace fear. The ship looked like a palace with its name sewn in light. I mistook glow for innocence. Training taught us to disappear. We learned how to step sideways when passengers walked, how to become fragrance and clean corners. I answered to a title that sounded ceremonial, cabin steward. But the meaning was simple. Move fast. Stay small. Fix what the day smudges. My badge opened a few doors. My schedule broke the rest of me. 14 hours were common, and the clock respected nobody. When you're that tired, you don't dream, you inventory darkness. The assignment that changed me arrived without ceremony. Overnight rotation, my lead said, tapping the column beside my name. Midnight to morning. Sanitize the closed spaces, crew corridors, service pantries, the clinic no one photographed for brochures. The medical bay sat on deck 3, where passengers never wandered. A belly of stainless steel, where everything reflected your face, back thin and truthful. The first night was quiet and pretended to be harmless. I mopped, logged temperatures, replaced biohazard liners, as if routine were a charm against surprise. Doors hummed open, drawers clicked shut, and I chased dust like it owed me money. A nurse nodded through her paperwork. She wore the expression of someone paid to be immaculate in a world allergic to it. The second night, routine broke its promise. Around 2:30, the corridor filled with footsteps that avoided their own echoes. They weren't medical staff. Their uniforms didn't match the drugs they handled. They moved like a sentence said without vowels. Fast, stripped, efficient. I slowed my mop and watched the way you watch a thunderhead that refuses to declare itself. Bags opened, cabinets unlatched, labeled boxes turned into plain wrappers. A hand passed blister packs into a container that had no label, no conscience, just space. My eyes felt treasonous in my head. I told myself it was inventory. I told myself I didn't know the language of ships yet, but repetition is its own confession. Night after night, the same choreography, arrivals at impossible hours, substitutions sleeker than lies, the room refilling with the exact symmetry of nothing. I saw insulin become anonymous, pain relief become theory. I saw men from housekeeping, women from food service, and a couple of neat uniforms with the tidy arrogance of junior officers, ranks that could slide through locked zones like knives through paper. One conversation erased the last of my denial. Two men stood outside the storage door, speaking softly and without ceremony, like weather. They named ports the way gamblers name horses. They counted profit, tallied shares, and joked about signature logs asleep under rubber stamps. Then they said the quiet part, in a voice I still hear when rooms go too still. Replacements that looked perfect, pills that dissolved into nothing but time, relief that arrived too late to be called relief. I'd been raised to believe medicine kept a promise. Here, medicine was keeping someone's books. Conscience is a muscle you can't afford to sprain at sea. I started documenting the way a body pulls in air before it learns the water is colder than it looks. My phone learned to be a mirror. Photos of hands, dates scribbled in a pocket notebook, initials calming my panic by pretending to be control. I listed cartons, clock times, door codes I wasn't supposed to remember. I learned to place my fear under housekeeping plastics, the way we hid everything else. The ring did not dress itself like a ring. It dressed itself like shift work. Supervisors' smiles, clipped orders, a don't ask courtesy between departments. The structure sat inside the ship like a second hull. Placebos where medications should be. Expired stock tucked into fresh cartons. Disposal logs that were actually shopping lists. The operation had weathered seasons and transfers. It survived on ignorance. And when ignorance failed, it survived on threat. I saw the dead in paperwork before I understood they were dead. Codes that meant life had ended without accusation. Pre-existing. Unrelated. Expected. Words that file loss into drawers where no one has to look again. On a ship that sold sunsets. Grief was a maintenance issue. Absorbent pads, a discreet elevator ride. A statement that read as though fate had signed first. When the name Rodriguez entered my story, it did not knock. He watched me without moving, the way a camera watches a lobby. Housekeeping supervisor, a ring of keys that could unlock most kinds of quiet. He was good at delegation, better at silence, best at convincing a hallway to empty itself of witnesses. I had the thought you never want to have about your own life. If he turns toward me, I will have to decide who I am. He turned. He caught me mid-photo. My phone angled toward a tray of repackaged insulin that had lost its name. The room didn't shout. The air simply thinned. Rodriguez walked close and let the space measure me. His face had the patience of someone who trusts consequences to do their work. "You're ambitious," he said, not asking. He didn't touch me. He touched the world around me, closed a drawer, straightened a label, moved a container half an inch. Ambition is expensive if you pay retail. I'd trained my mouth to be useful to passengers who needed extra towels and quiet miracles. It had no practice for this. If someone is sick, I said, they need what they were prescribed. Passengers need stories. He answered. They bought one already. Stunning landscapes, fine dining, professional care. Tell me which part of that sentence requires a particular molecule at 3 in the morning. You're stealing from them. He considered that. I'm reallocating from a company that taught me to survive on gratitude. He listed ports the way a pastor lists virtues. The money sounded like rain on a roof I didn't live under. Then he spoke about accidents, the way captains speak about weather. Inevitable. Impersonal. Some people can't keep a secret, he said. Some people can't swim. He offered me a choice and called it kindness. Work with them and double my income. Refuse and learn about consequences at inconvenient altitudes. The proof he carried was edited for impact. Photos of crew who had said no and been taught that verbs can become injuries. He let me look long enough to understand the pictures were not metaphors. The mind bargains when the body can't. I told him I understood. I asked efficient questions about schedule and roles, a quick study performing survival. He rewarded me with tasks that carried fingerprints, swapping labels, sealing packets, escorting sealed bags through corridors nobody loved. While my hands rehearsed betrayal, my eyes refused to retire. I kept a ledger in pencil, folded inside the laundry schedule. I wrote small and prayed my handwriting would learn to be humble. The part that breaks me, even now, was the paperwork they kept with pride. Lists that matched cabin numbers to substitutes. Notes about demand curves for pain relievers on Alaska legs. Spreadsheets neat enough to pass audit. I read about a man who believed he'd beaten illness by planning one last cruise with his daughter. He died quietly, body outpaced by sugar pills standing in for heart meds. I learned the phrase good outcome meant an untroubled disembarkation and a letter to the family, signed with condolences, engineered by legal counsel. When your job turns into an argument with your own reflection, you learn to move like fog. I mapped cameras. I learned which doors forgot to be loud. I borrowed a windbreaker with an officer's insignia stitched so perfectly it discouraged questions. I placed a drop phone inside a roll of blue nitrile and set alarms to vibrate inside my skin. I made friends with a guard who preferred cards to conversation and gladly lent his voice to a game that lasted the exact length of a hallway. My exit strategy hinged on Juno. Shore leave was short there. The gangway a throat that coughed crew in and out with bureaucratic rhythm. If I could step into daylight, carrying the right edits of the truth, I could hand them to someone not paid to protect a brand. My evidence sat in a cloud account under a name no one would miss. But clouds have ways of raining where you are. Paper still felt safer. I wrapped it in service manuals and trusted that nobody reads those after orientation. The last night before Juno tasted like an exam. Tasks multiplied. Eyes followed me without moving. I took photos only when a reflection already existed. Metal door, polished counter. So my phone could pretend it was admiring itself. Rodriguez assigned me to disposal, which really meant curation. Escort the guilt to the compactor and make sure it doesn't look like guilt in the trash room. I met the artifact I hadn't planned for. A small, soft-sided cooler, the color of clean water. Inside, vials that wore labels without dates. Syringes nested like teeth. A printed note that said a patient in cabin 6039 had experienced dizziness after a dosage that no longer existed, except on paper. I knew the woman in 6039. She tipped me in peppermint candy and called me honey, like I had been instructed to deserve it. The ship listed slightly, as if to consider what I would do next. I didn't pray. I rehearsed the hallway in my head, then folded the note into my shoe. When I walked back, Rodriguez watched me the way a shore watches tide charts. "You're learning," he said. "What happens if I keep learning?" I asked. "You get promoted?" he said, and smiled like a locked drawer. At sea, the safest place to hide is inside a promise you intend to break. Juno came in cold blue light that makes even lies crisp. Crew funneled down the gangway, carrying days off in their pockets. I wore my uniform like permission, and my fear like an undershirt. The sidewalk met me with the honest texture of land. I didn't run. Running invites narrators you don't choose. At the nearest station, a desk sergeant lifted his eyebrows at my story, the way people do when fiction arrives too sincere. I didn't offer drama. I offered names, times, cabinet logs photographed beside their own shadows, a ledger with neat columns, and a list of passengers who had traded medicine for counterfeit mercy. The sergeant stopped me twice to ask again, not because he doubted the crimes, but because the scale refused to be ordinary. Jurisdiction at sea is a knot that prefers to be admired, not untied. Local officers made calls that climbed ladders into federal rooms. The brand on my badge had lawyers with maps and alibis. Meanwhile, the ship prepared to sail, which is what ships do in the presence of truth. I handed over my paper evidence and the route to where the rest lived behind a password disguised as a grocery list. I watched men who move slowly when they mean yes, write down words like probable, chain, and preserve. I did not mention Rodriguez first. I wanted them to find him without my fear shaping their eyes. Back on board, the temperature of air changed. A rumor threaded the crew decks that somebody had invited daylight to supper. People I loved by routine stopped meeting my eyes. A nurse who had once pressed a cup of water into my hand now rearranged forms to build a small fort against me. The ring made 2 adjustments. It cleaned more carefully, and it smiled. Smiles are the perfect disguise for teeth. Interviews began. Officers in white took notes with pens that weighed more than rules. Some of the names I had written down evaporated into shore leave or transfer. One key cabinet shorted its electronic memory as if punishing itself for what it knew. Boxes I had photographed lost their barcodes overnight. This is how systems defend themselves. Not with denial, but with tidying. I didn't sleep. People who don't sleep make mistakes. So I did something careless and kind. I brought fresh towels to cabin 6039 without a work order. The peppermint woman opened the door and gifted me the same softness as before. I asked her about dizziness, as if I were pretending to care. In truth, I was trying to measure the harm by the size of her breath. She told me she had felt light, and then, Sign is a word with too many meanings. I wanted to escort her off the ship in my pocket and hand her to a clinic that didn't come with a gift shop. When the first set of charges landed, the headlines felt domesticated. The company answered with phrases engineered to be true without being useful. Individuals faced penalties that sounded like speed limits. A few went away long enough to confirm the system worked. Most returned to anywhere with their names shortened, and their habits improved by caution. The ship adjusted course and decorum, and kept selling sunsets because sunsets remained human and unlitigated. I quit without a speech. My last shift felt like rinsing a stage where the play had run too long. I handed in my badge and kept my ledger, not because the government needed it, but because memory is a place the guilty can't edit. If justice existed, It arrived by rowboat. The families of the quiet dead learned to hold grief that was never invited to testify. I learned to answer the question, how was ship life? With a sentence about the beauty of Alaska, the color of ice, the way whales move like kept promises. Then I learned to say, it taught me not to trust a smile that comes with a logo. Sometimes I dream in corridors. Not nightmares, exactly. Those have plot. These dreams have inventory. A cart that never empties. A clipboard that always finds a signature. A door that reads Medical Bay and opens into a room the size of responsibility. In those dreams, I am 19 again, and still think money is a key. I wake up knowing keys also lock, and yet, this part surprises me. I still believe in healing. I've seen hands that wrap bandages with a gentleness no company can brand. I've seen a nurse speak to a child as though language had been invented to keep her safe. There were islands of mercy on that ship, bright and unlicensed. The ring hid inside them, because goodness is the best camouflage. I cling to those moments so I can speak without becoming only a witness for the prosecution. I tell this now not to punish the sea, but to warn about rooms where light is measured and rented. Luxury is a costume that fits even the cruel. Systems don't confess, people do. And we confess not to end a story, but to force one into daylight, where it has to learn new words. If you ever find yourself on a deck where the air smells like bleach and secrecy, remember me. Remember the girl who mistook a contract for a plan and learned instead how to read a ledger of vanishing names. Remember that medicine is a promise formalized by science and redeemed by conscience. If either is missing, you're not in a clinic, you're in a market. I was 19. I am older now. I keep the truth folded, small enough to fit in a pocket, and big enough to light a corridor. Story number 7. I thought the ocean would be a lullaby. It became a frequency that answered back. I thought strangers on my screen were harmless. They learned my breathing like a password. I thought a ship meant safety. I didn't understand how steel can echo footsteps you can't find. I thought privacy was a setting. I learned it's a lock without a door. I thought adulthood was a horizon. It arrived the night the messages changed. I am Ariella, and I tell this while the shoreline is a thin graphite line in my memory. My name is Ariella is a sentence I used to post under sunsets. Unthinking. A caption for a life that glowed and scrolled. I was just 16 years old, orbiting friends through social media and group chats, certain that danger wore a mask I could recognize. We boarded the Holland America cruise ship, Westerdam, with my grandparents in July 2021. A family plan drawn in brochures. Buffet light, carpeted corridors, the Pacific coast penciled like a promise. I thought the ocean would borrow my worries and return them polished. Instead, it returned them magnified. The second night, the sea stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like a network cable. I connected to the ship's Wi-Fi and felt the familiar relief of being found by my phone. My feed sprouted new accounts, waves of greetings, tips about trivia nights, deck chair rumors. One handle stood out because it noticed everything. It spoke softly, as if not to wake whatever was sleeping in me. It referenced the color of my sweater, the seat I chose in the theater, the time I refilled my water bottle. The words felt weightless until they did not. They knew the curve of my path from pool to elevator, as if the hallway itself had learned my gait. Instagram became a corridor I could not see the end of. The account called itself Sea Watcher. It praised the ship's design, the Pacific hush after midnight. It wanted to run into me, an innocent phrase that suddenly felt like a physics problem. Velocity, angle, impact. At first, I floated on flattery. Then the messages sharpened, like lenses twisting into cruel focus. He described the tag on my tote bag, the steam on my glasses when I walked from sun into air conditioning, the moment I stood alone at a railing, believing the night belonged to me. There is a point where attention becomes inventory. I had crossed it without noticing. The photos started on the third day. One of me on our balcony, hair uncombed by the morning, stripes of ocean over my shoulder. It was intimate in a way I had not chosen. One photo showed me on my cabin's balcony in my pajamas. The angle slanted from some place that felt impossible, a vantage that suggested keys I did not own, restricted areas I did not know existed. Another image was worse for its ingenuity, shot from beneath the water's shine, a frame below the waterline where my body became a diagram for someone else's gaze. The water was clear. I was not prepared to be seen through it. I tried to pull the plug. I blocked him. I reported the accounts. I silenced, muted, buried. The voice returned wearing another name, then another, then 3 in one afternoon. The tone sweetened, then curdled. The sender migrated to messaging apps I'd never linked in public, a conjurer who could always guess the card in my hand. My chest turned into a hard shell that wouldn't allow breath to expand. I put the phone down. The phone did not put me down. He began to mention my grandparents, their routines, their preferred breakfast hour, the mug my grandfather favored because the handle didn't hurt his knuckles. Fear is not loud. It is methodical, I told my grandmother. We went to ship security with screenshots, timestamps, a list of usernames that multiplied like reflections in mirrored walls. I wanted them to say, "We know what to do." What I heard was policy. We're not sure. Hard to trace. Teens exaggerate. This is probably nothing. A uniform looked at the pictures as if they were weather we couldn't control. I understood something lonely. That proof can be too precise to be believed. We left the office with a pamphlet about online safety, and I folded it until the paper felt like a stone. The messages reacted to my report, like a wire touched to flame. They named where I stood in that very minute. They narrated my movements in the present tense. The words turned violent, then instructional. Threats braided into logistics, a list, a route, a timing window. They used the phrase international waters like a permission slip, a photo of a handle hidden under clothing, a diagram of hinges and latches, a plan to make a door behave like an invitation. I learned the shape of dread. You do not scream, you calculate. We restructured our days into something that could not be predicted. Room service, curtains drawn, hallways navigated only in pairs. Yet proof kept arriving to say that the pattern had already been solved. Images of secure corridors, a note describing our conversation about what movie to watch, word for word, as if the wall itself had memorized us. The ship became a geography of avoidance. No decks without cameras, no elevators if the cab wasn't already full, no seating with a back to the open. I had once loved maps. Now I loved blind corners that refused to reveal me. Then he confessed to a plural. He was not a lone current, but a riptide made of many. He sent screenshots of a hidden chat where usernames traded women like weather data, attributes, cabin numbers, pathways, techniques for accidental encounters. Some posts read like romance lessons written by wolves. Others read like history, cold with triumph. Stories of victims who had simply disappeared. Stories that ended because the horizon is not a witness. The typography of it, the emojis, the casual slang, made the cruelty look like a game people win. When the gangway finally touched the pier in Los Angeles, gravity returned. We handed everything to agents whose presence made the air feel reliable. The investigation met realities with complicated names, proxy servers, burner emails, logins that dissolved like salt, files without metadata, images with their pasts carefully erased, policies that made obtaining records a marathon of forms. We learned of Wi-Fi network logs that were rotated, a euphemism for a clock that eats evidence. We learned patience measured in subpoenas afterward. I carried silence the way others carry souvenirs. Crowds felt like code. Airports, elevators, lobbies, anywhere a camera could hide inside a smoke detector, became landscapes of caution. I haven't sworn off the world. I have learned to enter it as if it were a room full of unmarked doors. I became someone who writes letters, makes calls, asks uncomfortable questions in public meetings. I ask cruise companies what they do when predators treat their decks like hunting blinds. I ask law enforcement why the ocean should be a blind spot for accountability. There is courage in refusing to be polite about danger, and I still speak to the version of me who believed the ocean was a lullaby. I tell her that safety isn't paranoia, it's design. That privacy isn't a secret, it's a practice. That the line between convenience and consent is as thin as a signal, and just as breakable. That I survived. Yes, but survival is not the same as forgetting. If you're reading this while your device hums in your hand, understand, someone else can feel that hum from the other side. I keep a small list of things I will never apologize for reporting early, even though I was dismissed, for believing the evidence of my own fear, for keeping doors between me and strangers who request my time like they're ordering a drink, for saying out loud that the sea is beautiful and also dangerous, that both can be true and both can exist in one body, the oceans and mine. International waters is not a magic phrase. It is a gap where accountability goes missing. Gaps can be bridged. Systems can be re-engineered. Habits can be audited until they confess. Here is what I know now. The world is not in our phones. Our phones are in the world. The people behind them ride elevators, punch time clocks, borrow uniforms. They can learn your patterns, even when you think you are patternless. They can pass your image like contraband across chats you will never see. But you can make your life harder to harvest. You can refuse to be predictable. You can redraft the diary you write in public. And when you cannot fix the system from the inside, you can become the noise that makes it impossible to ignore. Holland, America cruise ship, Westerdam. July 2021. Pacific Coast. Instagram. Sea Watcher. Ship's Wi-Fi. Messaging apps grandparents, cabin's balcony, in my pajamas, restricted areas, below the waterline, ship security, international waters, Los Angeles, FBI, proxy servers, metadata, Wi-Fi network logs, predators. Story number 8. I was hired to count exits, not bodies. I was trained to analyze risk, not conspiracy. I know how steel fails, how cables snap, how drills uncover rot. What I saw on that voyage was not failure. It was design. And design has authors. They called me the chief who worried too much. They also called me Nathaniel. At 52 years old, experience teaches you to distrust coincidences. Patterns matter, silences matter, signatures in stripped threads, and hydraulic systems matter. On Scarlet Lady, patterns screamed, "This isn't a confession. It's a logbook, salvaged from a storm someone paid to summon." I boarded Virgin Voyage's Scarlet Lady on the Mediterranean run, expecting the same rhythm I'd known for 2 decades. Drills on Tuesday, inspections on Thursday, sleepless nights whenever the sea blamed us for what we missed. The vessel was the company's bright idea of a modern flagship, marketed as safer than common sense. My job description sounded modest. Confirm that emergency equipment matched the paperwork. Witness lifeboat deployments. Quiz crew on emergency procedures until muscle memory replaced doubt. That's the sales pitch. The truth begins where brochures end. The first clue was quiet. Metal usually tells its story. Burrs, discoloration, fatigue crescenting like the moon along an edge. On port side, davits. I found cuts pretending to be age. The emergency release mechanisms should have been stubborn in the right places, smooth everywhere else. Instead, I felt a drag that belonged to sabotage, a careful, calculated friction. The release cables looked as if time had chewed them, but the bite marks were too tidy. Anyone who has ever replaced a cable in bad weather knows the difference between corrosion and intent. I traced the lines, bled the valves, and found a stranger in the veins. Some cylinders were light where they should have been heavy. The hydraulic systems had been bled, then refilled with a fluid that would behave until pressure demanded loyalty. That's when betrayal shows itself. When I widened the inspection, the perimeter widened with me. Life rafts sealed with failure, fire suppression systems that would sneeze once, then stay silent, radios wired to transmit confidence and nothing else. I took what everyone takes in these moments: notes, photos, measurements. I also took a breath I didn't release for days. When you work safety long enough, you learn the 3 laws. 1. Never assume malice where ignorance explains the mess. 2. Never assume ignorance where money explains the plan. 3. Never assume you're the only one reading the laws. I brought my evidence to Captain Morrison. He kept the schedule on his desk like a map of a promised future. He listened the way people listen in courtrooms, not hospitals. Maintenance, he said. Wear and tear. We'll note it. He asked for a confidential report and reminded me of our duty to shield passenger safety from unnecessary panic. He underlined unnecessary with corporate ink. I left his cabin holding the same lid everyone holds on a boiling pot. The corporate investigators arrived flat, smelling of cologne and meetings. They asked if I was sleeping. They asked if I felt overworked. They asked whether I saw patterns that might not be there. They brought a consultant who'd never spent a night awake next to a pump room, and told me our emergency equipment was within acceptable parameters. Acceptable to what? I asked. To whom? They wrote that down as a concern about my tone. The ship gave me the answer the way ships always do. Uninvited. Half whispered in the steel. I wrong-turned into the officer pantry, and wrong stopped outside a door left almost closed. Inside, Morrison and a visitor from headquarters discussed the incident, as though it were a product launch with a quarterly window. I heard Italian territorial waters. I heard Naples. I heard deliberately sink the ship, without those words, daring to show their faces. I heard insurance, like a bell. And then I understood the engineering I'd been reading. We were a ledger, and someone was about to balance it with people. From that minute, I ceased being an employee. I became a witness. I mapped cameras and blind spots. I photographed every wounded bolt and patched raft. I left encrypted copies stitched into the ship's memory. Maintenance folders, renamed just enough to be overlooked by anyone certain of their own cleverness. I warned passengers the only way you can without starting a stampede. Practical advice about exits, shoes by the bed, a quiet request not to drink too deep on port nights. They pushed me sideways. New duties, new hours. My cabin inspected for my safety, which meant for theirs. My emails tiled with unable to send. The company's cure for risk is isolation, quarantining the person who can still say no. But the ocean has a way of carrying sound. Questions began to arrive in clusters, from crew, from passengers, from a customs officer who was also a cousin to a port inspector who loved coffee too much to ignore worry. When we docked in Rome, the dock itself made a call. The plan stalled. That's the word conspiracies fear most. Stall means time, and time means other people in other rooms opening other drawers. I stepped off Scarlet Lady with my material and met a law that looked me in the eyes. Investigations began the way wildfires do. Hot, hungry, quickly bracketed by a wind called money. Headlines came, then softened. Insurance fraud became procedural irregularities. Passengers became stakeholders. The chief officer, who wouldn't move along, became a footnote no one could quite erase. Executives lawyered the oxygen out of every room. Trials receded to those small fluorescent corridors where truth goes to learn patience. Corporate investigators called me a man past his prime, a maritime safety officer who mistook vigilance for paranoia. Some names disappeared from calendars, and then from countries. The ship itself was rebaptized like a sinner, with excellent counsel. New paint, new safety equipment, no plaque for what almost happened. I did what people do when a calling turns on them. I left the uniform, kept the oath. I file statements. I train families to choose cabins like lifeboats choose survivors. Near stairs, near light. I tell regulators to treat fire suppression systems like lungs. You don't need them until you only need them. I talk about life rafts and emergency release mechanisms and what a hydraulic lies like. I carry a quiet fear that somewhere a meeting is scheduling a storm. If you ever sail, pack your shoes, know your exits. Learn to read the ship the way it reads you. Trust officers who talk about failure more than fun. And remember, accidents rarely rehearse themselves. Conspiracies always do. I replay the approach they planned, because understanding the choreography is the only way to unlearn its spell. Choose a port with a camera-ready skyline. Choose water shallow enough to make recovery plausible, but not rescue. Sabotage what moves, mute what calls, poison what shields. Time it for routine docking procedures when vigilance is performed, not felt. In Naples, the tug's pull would have been the alibi, and the villain both. A sudden list explained by a miscommunication, explained by a language barrier, explained by the sea. All those explanations fit neatly into a claim form, but criminals leave fingerprints in choice, not just touch. Why pier-side systems and not open sea? Because the payout likes headlines more than wreckage. Why weaken communication systems? Because silence floods faster than water. Why ensure fire spreads? Because chaos teaches compliance and slows feet. Why seed doubt about the lone officer who refuses to play along? Because the story needs a madman. There's a sentence I never want anyone to forget. Ships do not drown by surprise. They drown by sequence. First, disable voice. Then, spoil muscle. Then, corner the crowd. Then, present inevitability. We broke their sequence, not with heroics, but with boredom. Questions, delays, inspections, clipboards. The miracle was not cinematic. It was clerical. And clerical is where truth hides, when courage runs out of places to stand. I wish I could say justice followed the same map. It didn't. The insurance angles were hedged. The corporate defenses rehearsed. Settlements were signed in rooms without windows. Sanctions read like inconveniences. The public heard safety culture. So often it became a lullaby. Meanwhile, someone stamped a new name on an old hull and sailed it into another season, as if a baptism could dry the blood. It never spilled, only because we made noise at the right hour. What remains is the oath. If you asked me what I learned, I'd say this: write everything down. Never fear the quiet technician who asks the same question twice. And whenever a captain loves a schedule more than a crew, adjust your life jacket. There are nights when I wake and taste salt and courtroom air at once. I make tea. I remember the passengers who tucked their shoes under beds because a stranger in a corridor told them to. I remember the junior engineer who handed me a USB by mistake. I remember Rome, where a clipboard ruined a plan. I remember that a ledger almost balanced itself with lives. I remember that I once boarded a ship to count exits and left to count stories told in time to matter. This is one of them. Story number 9. I kept a list of names no passenger ever heard, and the ocean kept the rest. The ship sold holidays, but below deck we bartered sleep for breath and hope for wages. I learned the routes of the waste pipes before I learned the stars above the fjords. Every time a door locked behind me, I counted how many keys existed and who held them. I believed I was hired to clean rooms. I was wrong. I was hired to vanish quietly. I came aboard for reasons that look noble when printed on a contract and cruel in practice. My name is Sutton, and I'm a 26-year-old woman from the Philippines who worked as a housekeeping supervisor aboard the Aida Prima during its Northern Europe route in the summer of 2018. I carried a folder of remittances already promised to an old man with aching knees and a girl who wanted to finish school. Like thousands of other Filipino workers, I had left my family behind to work on cruise ships. A recruiter called it opportunity. A purser called it staffing. I learned quickly that both were masks for extraction. The passenger decks smelled like citrus and lacquer. The crew decks, where I slept, carried the heat of bodies and bleach. The crew quarters aboard the Aidita Prima were located several decks below the passenger areas. Corridors arranged like a maze with no center. I shared a cabin with 3 women who taught me how to fold a duvet blindfolded and how to fold grief inside a smile. There were no windows, only a fan that nudged the stale air from one corner to another and back again. We learned to time our showers against the clock of the drain that often surrendered and sent yesterday back up to our ankles. I supervised 12 women who could turn a chaos of towels into the geometry of comfort in under 7 minutes. As housekeeping supervisor, I was responsible for ensuring that a team of 12 Filipino women cleaned over 200 passenger staterooms each day, plus the hallways and crew spaces no tourist would ever photograph. The quotas were a kind of arithmetic designed to fail the human body. You could meet the number or keep your sanity. You were not meant to keep both. When the tallies fell short, pay withered. When the tallies held, our backs did. Management wrote safety on posters and speed on our schedules. Degreaser stung our throats. Solvents lingered in our blood like unwelcome passengers that never disembarked. We signed more than contracts. We signed silence, allowances, disclaimers, acknowledgments that a complaint was a kind of mutiny. Filipino women were particularly vulnerable because paperwork placed a leash on our travel and a muzzle on our voices. The German officers and supervisors who controlled our working conditions made it clear: your job and your passport sleep in the same drawer, and we hold the key. Violence never needed an audience. Authority was audience enough. A corridor with a camera turned right just before the door that mattered. A uniform could open any lock. Consent was never issued a keycard. I counted outcomes instead of days. Who returned to the cabin? Who reported sick and was told that productivity cures all fevers? Who stared at the ceiling through the small hours and then rose to make beds for people who praised the turned-down chocolates and never noticed the hands that placed them? What I witnessed and experienced during those 8 months at sea was evidence of labor practices that amounted to slavery. I recorded it in a notebook disguised as a chore checklist, numbers standing in for names so that a search would find only dust counts and pillow inventories. I learned to file truth the way the ship filed waste: sort, compress, conceal the smell. Disappearances began as rumors, which is how truth often arrives when truth is dangerous. The official explanation was that she had fallen overboard during rough weather, but we had watched Maria walk with 2 officers toward a door that opened inward only. Her bunk was reassigned by the next rotation, her name deleted from the board by a marker that did not leave ghosts. Over the next several months, 6 more Filipino crew members disappeared under suspicious circumstances, each absence wrapped in a different story, each story ending with a dotted line where a signature should be. I discovered the part of the ship that made me older than my years, the rooms where waste changed its shape, the valves that cleared the evidence of living and anything that could be mistaken for it. I discovered that the ship had a system for disposing of bodies that made use of the onboard waste management facilities. And then I had to decide whether knowing was bravery or a countdown. Pumps don't ask questions. Registers don't write motives. Metal obeys orders, and orders protect metal. Copenhagen was circled on my calendar, not in ink, but in resolve. The plan was modest. Step onto concrete and speak where the law acknowledged me as human, not cargo. I copied schedules, photographed panels at the hour when the noise hid my steps, collected statements from the few who trusted me enough to attach their breath to a risk. I began planning my escape during our scheduled port call in Copenhagen, telling myself that timing is a kind of mercy we must make for ourselves when none is offered. Security arrived early, which is the nature of security when fear has already filed a report. I was detained in the ship's holding facility, a room that taught metal how to echo. They debated me as if I were a stain on carpet. Treat, remove, or cover. I could hear them discussing whether to eliminate me immediately or wait until we were back in international waters. I measured my chances by the thickness of a door and the attention span of a guard. Salvation is often inconvenient to those who profit from darkness. It knocks during a routine inspection and refuses to apologize for arriving without an appointment. A Danish port officer asked the one question that matters. Why is a worker behind a locked door? He did not accept the answer offered by men who have always been believed. He asked to speak to me alone. I laid the papers on the table with hands that refused to shake, because fear is a luxury, and I had none left to spend. I was able to turn over my documentation to the Danish inspector and provide him with detailed testimony. The investigation that followed became a geography lesson in jurisdiction and a master class in corporate defense. The criminal charges that were eventually filed resulted in minimal penalties and sentences that felt like delays, not justice. Witnesses were reassigned as if they were storage crates. Evidence traveled without a chain. The ship sailed on, because ships are designed to move forward, and the world is designed to admire movement more than it questions destination. I learned a final lesson standing on a quay as the Aida Prima left again with new names on its rosters and new families counting on those names. The people who clean their cabins, serve their food, and maintain their ships are often trapped in conditions that amount to slavery. Tourism hides its engines well. Industry hides its dead better. If you book a cabin with a view, ask yourself who has no window. If you sleep easy, ask yourself who never sleeps. If you return home, count the ones who do not. Story number 10. I thought the ocean would wash the noise out of my head. I thought a week at sea could reset a broken compass. I thought brands were guardians, contracts were shields, and smiling mascots could keep the night at bay. I thought the ship's cameras were there to protect us, not to watch us sleep. I was wrong about all of it. I introduced myself to the wind long before I learned how to introduce myself to people. Still, there's a certain ceremony in saying it out loud. My name is Ada, 45, a mother, a person who once believed that distance from land could distance me from old worries. In February 2020, I took my kids on a 7-day cruise to the Bahamas because I wanted applause from the horizon. I wanted a mirror big enough to resize the smallness that had crept into my days. The ship rose from its berth, white and confident, with a name painted in gold script, Arcadia of the Tides. Corporate videos promised coconut sunsets and laughter arranged like predictable constellations. I bought the promise because I needed one. My daughter, Emma, was 8, a collector of seashells in theory, a collector of questions in practice. My son, Tyler, was 6, thin as a kite string and capable of lecturing strangers about clouds. They didn't need perfection. They needed me to stop measuring the distance between fear and love with receipts and overtime slips. I told myself the ocean had ceremonies for people like us. The brochures had a program for children, supervised activities with badges and lanyards. Words like safety, care, and world class moved across the screen in clean fonts. I signed them up because I wanted them to have a room in the world that didn't depend on me standing guard at the door. On the second day, the sky wore a glassy smile and the decks smelled faintly of citrus and brass. The youth club sat behind a wall of cheerful decals, stars, waves, cartoon faces, framed by large windows. Parents could watch from the corridor as if peering into a snow globe. The counselors wore color-coded polos and patient expressions that felt rehearsed, like ambassadors of sunlight. I told myself rehearsal was a good thing. No one stumbles on stage in a place where everything is practiced to the second. Emma went in with a cardboard pirate hat she'd decorated herself, teeth clenched with concentration, the way she does when she wants to be brave. Tyler wiggled out of my hand before I was ready and lined up at a foam archway labeled Adventure Portal. 10 minutes later, I saw both of them laughing in a ring of other children, while a counselor guided them through a choreography of claps and spins. A camera sat in the corner, its dark lens a little planet reflecting every movement. I tried to name the feeling that pricked my neck and failed. Maybe it was pride, maybe rest, maybe the bruise-colored memory of all the times I'd fallen short. The first hour was peaceful. The second hour was orderly. The third hour began to glitch. A counselor in blue moved children from groups of 5 to groups of 3, and my eyes told me it was only logistics. A green shirt tapped a tablet near the camera, and a tiny light flared, then dimmed, like a heartbeat, practicing not to be caught. A melody played from a hidden speaker, the kind that tries to be invisible by being pleasant. I told myself to breathe. When a mother is tired, she starts naming coincidence as danger. At dinner, Emma asked if we could eat in our cabin with the curtains closed. Tyler lined his peas in the exact pattern of the ship's logo, an infinity loop disguised as a wave. I asked them how the club was, but Emma said the room felt echoey, as if they were talking and listening inside someone else's head. Tyler said, matter of fact, that the counselors liked to ask for special stillness, a game where the kids should sit very quietly and imagine the same picture at the same time. He was impressed at how fast he could make his thoughts tidy. I laughed like an adult who believes in imaginative games. That night, both of them slept with their faces turned to the wall, as if a lesson had taught them how to become surfaces. I woke to the sense that someone had rearranged the air. On the corridor monitor that loops the ship's activities, the youth club appeared in clips. Children stacking soft blocks, counselors guiding safe science experiments, stickers and smiles. But sometimes, just before the clip changed, I saw a freeze frame, children sitting perfectly still, eyes widened just a little, a hush that wasn't play. The screen jumped to the next clip then, like a magician changing scarves. By the fourth morning, I decided to watch in person. I planted myself near the window with a paper cup of tea and the kind of patience that pretends to be casual. The counselors were relentlessly kind, but there's a kind of kindness that carries a metronome. A red shirt gathered a cluster of younger kids to a corner where a mural of the sea curled over them like a painted ceiling. He asked them to look at the mural and breathe together. An orange shirt hovered near the camera and typed. When the breathing started, the children's shoulders fell at the same second. The adults smiled, satisfied, and I recognized it. Not love, not care, but alignment. I stepped inside and asked to speak with a supervisor. A woman named Portia, sleek bob, perfect badge, trained sympathy, told me everything was monitored, audited, evaluated. Every counselor had background checks. Every room had cameras. Every moment had a log. When I asked about the special stillness, Portia explained it was a mindfulness activity designed by their wellness consultants. She used phrases like empower attention, self-soothing, and cognitive anchors. She thanked me for caring and escorted me out with words that were as soft as carpeting. By the time the elevator doors closed, I had been converted, slightly, into the kind of person who must explain her concern with a statistic to make it real. That evening, Emma insisted she didn't want to go back, which should have been enough. But I had paid for a promise and didn't know how to admit I was already grieving it. We went to the upper deck instead, where performers in sailor stripes hosted a quiz about sea creatures. A projected jellyfish drifted across an LED screen, its pulse slow and beautiful. The kids clapped in time without being told to. The screen's logo pulsed with them. A loop and a wave, a wheel that didn't want to stop turning. Tyler whispered that he could hear the jellyfish thinking. I told him jellyfish don't have brains. He said that was why it was easy to listen. Night shoved the day into a neat drawer. I dreamed of a corridor that had the same door repeated. And when I opened it, my children were sitting cross-legged on a floor that wasn't a floor, listening to a song I couldn't hear. I woke with the taste of copper and panic. I got dressed and walked. The ship had a midnight personality, polished, echoing, endless. On deck 7, past a gift shop, where every plush smile was neatly sewn. I found a small door marked Edmund. The lock wasn't a lock, just a handle that required a mood it trusted. Inside was an empty office with a wall of screens, each showing a different area of the ship. Most were empty. One showed the youth club, though the schedule said it was closed. The room was lit blue from the monitors, and I understood why children would trust a whale. On the screen, I saw the mindfulness circle, but the children weren't there. The counselors were. They sat in the same shape, breathing at the same time, eyes open as if testing their own obedience. A soft footstep behind me made me turn. A security officer stood at the door with professional neutrality and asked if I needed help. His badge read, M. Hale? I told him I was lost. He believed me, probably because he preferred it. He escorted me back to the main corridor, mentioned that some areas were for staff only, and added that the ship's cameras were always on to keep us safe. It was almost convincing. I told myself to accept ordinary explanations. Professional teams rehearse. Wellness programs include breathing exercises. Children mimic rhythms. The ocean plays tricks on sleep. And yet, the next afternoon, a young counselor crouched to Emma's height and asked if she remembered the picture from yesterday's special quiet. He asked it like someone checking a password. When Emma shook her head, he smiled and said it was a game, nothing more, and that she could try again tomorrow if she wanted. Then he touched a tablet that hummed in the air without making a sound. Emma's pupils widened, then softened, as if a wave had passed through them. I took her hand. The counselor smiled with a softness that had no temperature. I went to guest services and asked to see the youth activities manager. The person who came out was a man in a navy suit, bright tie, eyes that shimmered like a PowerPoint. He introduced himself as Marcus, smiled precisely, and launched into assurances. Audits, partners, third-party evaluations, certification acronyms like alphabet soup. I told him I wanted my children withdrawn from the program. He agreed, perfectly agreeable, then added that the activities would follow us anyway. In the theaters, by the pool, on every deck's ambient screen, because wellness was a ship-wide initiative. For harmony, he said, for guest balance. He said those words the way a metronome says a beat. That night, our cabin door had been set with the chain when we left, and the chain was unlatched when we returned. My suitcase zipper had migrated half an inch, a pilgrimage only a zipper would undertake. On the vanity, the daily program had been folded into a triangle and placed exactly 1 inch from the mirror's base. The triangle pointed at a tiny notice: family focus, night in the small theater on deck 3, optional, it said. A highlight, it said. A celebration of togetherness, it said. I lay awake, counting ceiling dots, until they added up to something that felt like an answer. I didn't want to go. I went anyway, because fear has a way of insisting on proof. The small theater had 2 aisles and smelled of new upholstery and recently made decisions. Families shuffled in under soft lights. On stage, a projection of a lighthouse turned slowly in a loop, the beam sweeping the audience again and again. The host explained that we would play a memory game together, an all-ages alignment exercise designed by their wellness team. The goal was to think the same image at the same moment, to feel the comfort of a shared picture. A staff member walked through the rows with a basket of cards. Each card had a different symbol: a key, a wave, a compass, an hourglass. When she reached our row, she handed Emma a card with a key and Tyler a card with a wave. She gave me a blank card, which I didn't understand until the host announced adults would be anchors and children would be voyagers. The lights dimmed. The lighthouse kept turning. The exercise began. On the screen, shapes cascaded in muted colors, too smooth to be random. We were instructed to breathe in and out, to imagine the same shape at the same second, guided by the lighthouse's sweep. I counted silently in my head to stay separate. At count 5, the screen paused. The host asked if anyone had felt the image arrive. Several children raised their hands at the same moment. My scalp prickled. The host praised them and asked how they knew. A girl in the second row said she felt it in her teeth. A boy in the back said it came from the corners and slid into the middle. Afterward, Crew members moved efficiently to congratulate families, to sell photo packages, to schedule more alignment. I guided my children out, past a table of plush whales and looped waves stamped on travel mugs. In the corridor, a counselor in blue walked parallel to us on the other side of a glass wall. He lifted a hand just once, the exact height of my shoulder, then let it drop without looking at me. I recognized the gesture from the mindfulness circle, a signal disguised as intention. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I went back to Deck 7. The admin door expected a mood it trusted, and I had practiced it all night. Inside, the wall of screens blinked. I tapped through menus until one labeled Harmony Dash opened. A map of the ship appeared, every deck rendered as a clean diagram with soft, pulsing points. Pings corresponded to bracelet chips and cabin keys. The youth club had dozens of points. The small theater had more. A tab labeled Family Focus showed metrics: participation, synchronization percentage, coherence pulse. Another tab, Insights, offered phrases: guest alignment, improving; Voyager responsiveness, medium-high; anchors, variable. A third tab, Reminders, contained scripts for staff, phrases to say, phrases to avoid, a guide on how to reframe questions as gratitude. A fourth tab, Seascape, led to a list of consultants, a firm called Mariner Guidance, with a logo shaped like the symbol for infinity, if it forgot how to end. I copied what I could with my phone. Blurry photos of screens, lists of terms, a frame of the lighthouse beam paused on faces. The door clicked behind me. Security. 2 officers, serious as stairways, escorted me to an office where Marcus sat with a smile he had practiced enough to patent. He asked if I had concerns. I told him I did. He asked if I had proof. I showed him what I had. He looked at the photos briefly and said they seemed out of context, deceptively framed, not representative. He reminded me of the signed terms and the guest harmony agreement that allowed mood balancing programming ship-wide. He used phrases like consent by presence and ambient participation. I asked if the ship's wellness program had ever gone through an independent ethics review. He said it had partners and acronyms. I asked who Mariner Guidance was. He said they were experts. He didn't say at what. I withdrew my children from everything. We ate in our cabin with the curtains open because I wanted the horizon to watch us. When staff knocked to invite us to special events, I said we were unwell. When a counselor told Tyler he could visit the club just to pick up a sticker, I said he had outgrown stickers. At night, I dreamed of the lighthouse again. This time, the beam wasn't sweeping. It was measuring. On the last day, a crew member slid an envelope under our door. Inside was a survey and a voucher. The survey asked about satisfaction, wellness, harmony, balance. A QR code promised a prize drawing. The voucher awarded me a discount on a future cruise. It is a particular talent to offer a person more of what they can no longer take. We disembarked in a city that stared at the sea as if it would confess. At the terminal, a customer relations representative with soft eyes and symmetrical hair invited me to share feedback. I asked if the ship's cameras ran analytics on children's faces. She said the ship did not collect or store biometric data, which was not the same as no. but close enough for a press release. I asked again about mariner guidance. She said it was a third-party vendor, and vendors rotate, like the tides. She thanked me for choosing Arcadia. I hadn't chosen Arcadia. I had chosen the version of myself who thought the ocean could launder fear at home. I sent letters to agencies that like to receive letters. I filed complaints that asked questions in the shape of evidentiary trees. I learned how much of the ocean is a jurisdictional shrug. Emails came back thanking me for my concern and explaining that wellness programming with consent by presence fell into a gray area. A gray area is useful to people who prefer not to choose a color. Emma stopped sleeping on her back. Tyler stopped drawing clouds and started drawing lighthouses. When I asked why, he said lighthouses are what the night uses to count people. I reminded him that lighthouses are meant to protect ships from rocks. He said sometimes rocks are the only thing that won't move. I didn't become an activist. I became stubborn. I filed more things. I documented. I found other families who had felt the same strangeness on different ships with different names, but the same looped wave, the same emphasis on harmony, the same alignment exercises introduced with the same rehearsed patience. We traded phrases like map fragments, coherence pulse, anchor variance, Voyager drift. We asked why our children felt emptied out after games designed to fill them. We learned that consultants rebrand and reappear, that contracts dissolve and reform, that lighthouses can change colors without changing the beam. Months later, a former staffer messaged me from a new job on land. She said the wellness program had been sold to 6 companies, each claiming it improved attention and reduced tantrums. When I asked if the program collected faces, she said the system measured response markers, which could be anything if you refused to define it. She signed off with a sentence that keeps circling in my head. They call it harmony, so they don't have to call it control. I tell this now, in the quiet hour when windows become mirrors, not to scare anyone away from the ocean, but to name the room behind the room. If you go at all, go with your own lighthouse and keep its beam for yourselves. Ask who gets the data generated by your breath. Ask why a child's stillness is worth a metric. If an exercise makes your family feel empty, call it what it is. If someone offers you a discount on the next wave, check whether you've learned how to swim. The sea doesn't owe us comfort. It owes us nothing and gives us everything we can survive. I used to believe that distance from land meant distance from what haunts us. Now I believe the opposite. Open water is a mirror that stretches too wide to ignore. The ship we boarded promised laughter organized by professionals. What it delivered was a vocabulary I never wanted to know. I am not brave. I am a person who once believed in rehearsals. Now I believe in interruptions. This is mine. Story number 11. The sea looked polished, like a mirror no one dared to breathe on. I had spent 15 years scripting joy, yet every smile on that ship felt rented. When the lights died, the truth arrived. Quiet, heavy, impossible to return. I learned that safety is only a story. That night, the story stopped believing in itself. If you want the neat version, ask the company. I will tell you what it felt like. I was the cruise director on a vessel marketed as effortless happiness. a floating calendar of galas, trivia, dance lessons, and midnight buffets. My name is Diego, and my job was to keep the hours stitched together so no one ever felt the seam. For 6 days across the bright blue chessboard of the Mediterranean, that illusion held. On the 7th, the board flipped. Power staggered first. A tremor in the lights, a smudge in the music, and then the ventilation rested its constant breath. Hallways narrowed, carpets kept the day's warmth, and gave it back without mercy. A message from the bridge promised we would reset the night with a switch and a checklist. I was meant to repeat that promise. I tried. The words felt like cards turning damp in my hands. Within an hour, the engines were a memory. Navigation, water treatment, internal communications. Each system dimmed to a rumor. I watched the crew choose their faces. Calm, instructional, broad-shouldered certainty. I chose the same mask and walked the ship, collecting questions I could not answer. The children asked if the shows would still happen. The parents asked how long. The elderly asked where the cool air had gone. No one asked what happens to a city when the water stops. We had stored kindness in ice and compressors. When those failed, kindness melted into arithmetic. Without running water, the simplest tasks became negotiations with the body. Restrooms told the future. Kitchen staff rationed packages they had never meant to open. I organized queues for food and bottled water, and people obeyed until someone did not. That is how it begins. One skipped line becomes two, and then the line forgets it was ever a line. Temper rose with the ship's interior. In lounges and stairwells, people assembled around the last reliable power. Information. Some had satellite phones and traded signal for certainty. Most had nothing but suspicion, which multiplies faster than any official update. I carried a battery lantern and a notebook. I wrote names of volunteers, decks that needed first aid, cabins with insulin running warm. The lantern made a circle of daylight that could fit 4 people if they were generous. Sometimes they were generous. By dawn, the ship possessed new borders that no mapmaker had drawn. Language gathered with language. Family recognized family. Strength found itself and stood together. I saw kindness done carefully at first. Someone passing a bottle, someone giving up a seat. I also saw the market open. Offers for medicine, for water, for a place near a window where the air moved as though it remembered the old world. The price was anything another person might want. The first full confrontation happened in the main dining room, a cathedral of chrome and velvet now lit by emergency bars along the floor. The kitchen tried for fairness, small portions, a promise to rotate service. An argument between tables inflated into a geography of bodies. I stepped in with staff to calm it, and for a minute, people listened. Then a plate of fruit became an accusation, and the room learned how quickly a hand can close into something else. When it broke apart, the floor held the evidence: shoe prints in spilled juice, a napkin tied like a tourniquet, dignity torn in the corner like a paper menu. Medical was a corridor of triage powered by batteries that had their own countdown. The doctor worked like a lighthouse, cutting through waves of need. But there was no tide schedule anymore. We taped signs asking passengers to conserve water and report injuries. We posted stewards at stairwells to keep the traffic safe. The ship had other plans. Factions formed, as if the ship itself had subdivided into kingdoms. One group took the sunny top decks, defending shade and railings with barricades and polite words that could turn. Another group, young crew and guests who understood storage more than scenery, held the lower decks near pantries and maintenance rooms. They had supply, but little air. Others parted into smaller circles, led by someone with a voice that traveled well. Each circle wrote its own rules on the air and enforced them with presence. I moved between these new cities with a whistle I did not use and authority that evaporated under heat. I asked for truces around drinking stations and safe corridors for families and the elderly. Sometimes a leader agreed because his child was sick, or because his partner wanted a quiet hour. Sometimes I traded. A box of gauze for 10 minutes on a staircase. Each small success felt like a candle saved from the wind. And each failure reminded me that candles are not policy. Night returned without temperature relief. Rumors arrived ahead of sleep. A rescue convoy. A helicopter. A radio contact no one could verify. The rumor that mattered said that not everyone would leave at once. That sentence took the little order we had manufactured and shook it by the throat. People counted lifeboat seats. People measured distance to ladders. People stared at their children and turned the math into steel. Violence did not announce itself. It simply became the language fastest understood. I watched a man defend a stairwell with a broken stanchion the way he might once have defended an idea. I saw someone surrender a place on the rail and then take it back with more friends. I stepped between two women arguing over a life jacket and felt their fear move through me the way a wave goes through a hull. Soundless. Total. I learned that courage is mostly the refusal to run from a job that no longer pays your beliefs. I remember the worst moments clearly because the ship taught me to. An elderly guest vanished over a railing where the breeze was kinder. A young mother collapsed protecting space for her children while strangers negotiated around her. In medical, bandages took on the color of the day and could not be changed fast enough. We cleaned with bottled water until bottled water became medicine and then became currency. The doctor's hands shook once when she thought no one was looking. I said nothing because I needed her to believe she was the last unshakable thing on board. On the third night, the ocean was black glass, and everyone listened for proof of rescue. When the first light flickered on the horizon, it might have been imagination. Imagination was enough. Entire sections of the ship migrated toward lifeboat stations in slow, decisive waves. The factions dissolved into a single animal with many minds, each certain it was next. Crews shouted plans, but plans did not translate. Hope is messy when it is fresh. I found myself on the bridge, at last, not as a leader, but as a witness. Officers worked the dead panels like musicians determined to finish a performance after the power went out. A junior navigator drew grid lines on a paper chart with the kind of concentration people reserve for prayers. When the radio finally carried a human voice that was not ours, the room did not cheer. We exhaled in the quiet way people do when pain numbers itself and puts on a uniform. Rescue did arrive. And it was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic, methodical, and insufficient at first. We prioritized medical evacuations. We stabilized what we could. We made lists that ended in numbers lower than anyone wanted. The ship, our brief country, saw order return in the form of clipboards, uniforms, and measured words. The morning that followed felt bleached. Deck chairs were overturned, doors wedged open, signage gone askew, a luxury hotel rearranged by panic into a museum of what people chose when choosing felt like oxygen. Afterward, statements were collected and stories were tidied. Systems failed, assistants arrived, operations resumed. I was offered scripts with polished edges and told that precision protects livelihoods. Perhaps it does. I kept mine folded and wrote this instead. I do not name the worst of us, and I will not forget the best. The teenager who carried inhalers to strangers. The sous chef who devised a rotation so 200 people could share 30 liters of drinkable water. The housekeeper who stood at a doorway and turned herself into a boundary so a mother could sleep. I left cruise work soon after, not from hatred, but from comprehension. A ship is a promise engineered to be kept by separate systems working in quiet harmony. When the harmony breaks, what remains is not a monster or a miracle. It is us. We are sufficient and we are dangerous. The ocean does not judge either condition. It simply holds our reflection until we are ready to look.